Chapter 19. Faithful to the program laid down by his accomplice, while Louis watched at Oloron, Raoul remained in Paris with the purpose of recovering the confidence and affection of Madame Fauvel, and of lulling any suspicions which might arise in her breast. The task was difficult, but not impossible. Madame Fauvel had been distressed by Raoul's wild extravagance, but had never ceased to love him. Whatever faults he had committed, whatever future follies he might indulge in, he would always remain her best-loved child, her firstborn, the living image of her noble, handsome Gaston. The lover of her youth. She adored her two sons, Lucien and Abel. But she could not overcome an indulgent weakness for the unfortunate child, torn from her arms the day of his birth, abandoned to the mercies of hired strangers, and for 20 years deprived of home influences and a mother's love. She blamed herself for Raoul's misconduct, and accepted the responsibility of his sins, saying to herself, "It is my fault. But for me, he would not have been exposed to the temptations of the world." Knowing these to be her sentiments, Raoul did not hesitate to take advantage of them. Never were more irresistible fascinations employed for the accomplishment of a wicked object. Beneath an air of innocent frankness, this precocious scoundrel concealed wonderful astuteness and penetration. He could at will adorn himself with the confiding artlessness of youth, so that angels might have yielded to the soft look of his large dark eyes. There were few women living who could have resisted the thrilling tones of his sympathetic voice. During the month of Louis's absence, Madame Fauvel was in a state of comparative happiness. Never had this mother and wife, this pure, innocent woman, in spite of her first and only fault, enjoyed such tranquility. She felt as one under the influence of enchantment, while reveling in the sunshine of filial love, which almost bore the character of a lover's passion. For Raoul's devotion was ardent and constant, his manner so tender and winning, that anyone would have taken him for Madame Fauvel's suitor. As she was still at her country seat, and M. Fauvel went into the city every morning at 9 o'clock, and did not return till 6, she had the whole of her time to devote to Raoul. When she had spent the morning with him at his house in Vézenet, she would often bring him home to dine and spend the evening with her. All his past faults were forgiven, or rather the whole blame of them was laid upon Clamaran. For, now that he was absent, had not Raoul once more become her noble, generous, affectionate son, the pride and consolation of her life? Raoul enjoyed the life he was leading, and took such an interest in the part that he was playing, that his acting was perfect. He possessed the faculty which makes cheats successful, faith in his own impostures. Sometimes he would stop to think whether he was telling the truth, or acting a shameful comedy. His success was wonderful. Even Madeleine, the prudent, distrustful Madeleine, without being able to shake off her prejudice against the young adventurer, confessed that perhaps she had been influenced by appearances, and had judged unjustly. Raoul not only never asked for money, but even refused it when offered, saying that, now that his uncle was away, his expenses were but trifling. Affairs were in this happy state when Louis arrived from Oloron. Although now immensely rich, he resolved to make no change in his style of living, but returned to his apartments at the Hôtel du Louvre. His only outlay was the purchase of a handsome carriage. And this was driven by Manuel, who consented to enter his service, although Gaston had left him a handsome little fortune, more than sufficient to support him comfortably. Louis's dream, the height of his ambition, was to be ranked among the great manufacturers of France. He was prouder of being called Iron Founder than of his marquisate. During his adventurous life, he had met with so many titled gamblers and cutthroats, that he no longer believed in the prestige of nobility. It was impossible to distinguish the counterfeit from the genuine. He thought what was so easily imitated was not worth the having. Dearly bought experience had taught him that our unromantic century attaches no value to armorial bearings, unless their possessor is rich enough to display them upon a splendid coach. One can be a marquis without a marquisate, but it is impossible to be a forge master without owning ironworks. Louis now thirsted for the homage of the world. All the badly digested humiliations of the past weighed upon him. He had suffered so much contempt and scorn from his fellow men, that he burned to avenge himself. After a disgraceful youth, he longed to live a respected and honored old age. His past career disturbed him little. He was sufficiently acquainted with the world to know that the noise of his coach wheels would silence the jeers of those who knew his former life. These thoughts fermented in Louis's brain as he journeyed from Pau to Paris. He troubled his mind not in the least about Raoul, determined to use him as a tool so long as he needed his services, and then pay him a large sum if he would go back to England. All these plans and thoughts were afterward found noted down in the diary which he had in his pocket at the time of the journey. The first interview between the accomplices took place at the Hôtel du Louvre. Raoul, having a practical turn of mind, said he thought that they both ought to be contented with the result already obtained, and that it would be folly to try and grasp anything more. "What more do we want?" he asked his uncle. "We now possess over 1,000,000, let us divide it and keep quiet. We had better be satisfied with our good luck, and not tempt Providence." But this moderation did not suit Louis. "I am rich," he replied, "but I desire more than wealth. I am determined to marry Madeleine, I swear she shall be my wife. In the first place, I madly love her, and then, as the nephew of the most eminent banker in Paris, I at once gain high position and public consideration. I tell you, uncle, your courtship will involve you in great risks. I don't care if it does. I choose to run them. My intention is to share my fortune with you. But I will not do so till the day after my wedding. Madeleine's fortune will then be yours." Raoul was silent. Clameron held the money, and was therefore master of the situation. "You don't seem to anticipate any difficulty in carrying out your wishes," he said discontentedly. "How are you to account for your suddenly acquired fortune?" M. Fauvel knows that a Clameron lived at Oloron, and had money in his bank. You tell him that you never heard of this person bearing your name, and then, at the end of the month, you come and say that you have inherited his fortune. People don't inherit fortunes from perfect strangers, so you had better trump up some relationship. You are an innocent youth, nephew, your ingenuousness is amusing. Explain yourself." "Certainly. The banker, his wife, and Madeleine must be informed that the Clameron of Oloron was a natural son of my father, consequently my brother, born at Hamburg, and recognized during the emigration. Of course, he wished to leave his fortune to his own family. This is the story which you must tell Madame Fauvel tomorrow. That is a bold step to take." "How so?" "Inquiries might be made." "Who would make them?" "The banker would not trouble himself to do so. What difference is it to him whether I had a brother or not? My title as heir is legally authenticated. And all he has to do is to pay the money he holds, and there his business ends. I am not afraid of his giving trouble. Do you think that Madame Fauvel and her niece will ask any questions? Why should they? They have no grounds for suspicion. Besides, they cannot take a step without compromising themselves. If they knew all our secrets I would not have the least fear of their making revelations. They have sense enough to know that they had best keep quiet." Not finding any other objections to make, Raoul said. "Very well, then, I obey you, but I am not to call upon Madame Fauvel for any more money, am I?" "And why not, pray?" "Because, my uncle, you are rich now." "Suppose I am rich," replied Louis, triumphantly, "what is that to you? Have we not quarreled about the means of making this money? And did you not heap abuse upon me until I consider myself justified in refusing you any assistance whatever? However, I will overlook the past. And, when I explain my present plan, you will feel ashamed of your former doubts and suspicion. You will say with me, success is certain." Louis de Clameron's scheme was very simple, and therefore unfortunately presented the strongest chances of success. We will go back and look at our balance sheet. As heretofore, my brilliant nephew, you seem to have misunderstood my management of this affair. I will now explain it to you. I am listening. In the first place, I presented myself to Madame Fauvel, and said not, your money or your life, but your money or your reputation. It was a rude blow to strike, but effective. As I expected, she was frightened, and regarded me with the greatest aversion. Aversion is a mild term, uncle. I know that. Then I brought you upon the scene. And, without flattering you in the least, I must say that your opening act was a perfect success. I was concealed behind the curtain, and saw your first interview. It was sublime. She saw you, and loved you, you spoke a few words and won her heart. And but for you? Let me finish. This was the first act of our comedy. Let us pass to the second. Your extravagant follies, your grandfather would have said, your dissoluteness, soon changed our respective situations. Madame Fauvel, without ceasing to worship you, you resemble Gaston so closely, was uneasy about you. She was so frightened that she was forced to come to me for assistance. Poor woman! I acted my part very well, as you must confess. I was grave, cold, indignant, and represented the distressed uncle to perfection. I spoke of the old probity of the Clamorins, and bemoaned that the family honor should be dragged in the dust by a degenerate descendant. For a short time I triumphed at your expense, Madame Fauvel forgot her former prejudice against me, and soon showed that she esteemed and liked me. That must have been a long time ago. Louis paid no attention to this ironical interruption. Now we come to the third scene, he went on to say, the time when Madame Fauvel, having Madeleine for an adviser, judged us at our true value. Oh! You need not flatter yourself that she did not fear and despise us both. If she did not hate you, Raoul, it was because a mother's heart always forgives a sinful child. A mother can despise and worship her son at the same time. She has proved it to me in so many touching ways, that, yes, even I, hardened as I am, was moved, and felt remorse. Parbleu! I have felt some pangs myself. Where did I leave off? Oh, yes. Madame Fauvel was frightened, and Madeleine, bent on sacrificing herself, had discarded Prosper, and consented to marry me, when the existence of Gaston was suddenly revealed. And what has happened since? You have succeeded in convincing Madame Fauvel that you are pure, and that I am blacker than hell. She is blinded by your noble qualities, and she and Madeleine regard me as your evil genius, whose pernicious influence led you astray. You are right, my venerated uncle. That is precisely the position you occupy. Very good. Now we come to the fifth act, and our comedy needs entire change of scenery. We must veer around. Change our tactics? You think it difficult, I suppose? Nothing easier. Listen attentively, for the future depends upon your skillfulness. Raoul leaned back in his chair, with folded arms, as if prepared for anything, and said, I am ready. The first thing for you to do, said Louis, is to go to Madame Fauvel tomorrow, and tell her the story about my natural brother. She will not believe you, but that makes no difference. The important thing is, for you to appear convinced of the truth of what you tell her. Consider me convinced. 5 days hence, I will call on M. Fauvel, and confirm the notification sent him by my notary at Oloron, that the money deposited in the bank now belongs to me. I will repeat, for his benefit, the story of the natural brother, and ask him to keep the money until I call for it, as I have no occasion for it at present. You, who are so distrustful, my good nephew, may regard this deposit as a guarantee of my sincerity. We will talk of that another time. Go on. Then I will go to Madame Fauvel, and say, being very poor, my dear madam, necessity compelled me to claim your assistance in the support of my brother's son, who is also yours. This youth is worthless and extravagant. Thanks, my good uncle. He has poisoned your life when he should have added to your happiness. He is a constant anxiety and sorrow to your maternal heart. I have come to offer my regrets for your past trouble, and to assure you that you will have no annoyance in the future. I am now rich, and henceforth take the whole responsibility of Raoul upon myself. I will provide handsomely for him. Is that what you call a scheme? Parbleu, you will soon see whether it is. After listening to this speech, Madame Fauvel will feel inclined to throw herself in my arms, by way of expressing her gratitude and joy. She will refrain, however, on account of her niece. She will ask me to relinquish my claim on Madeleine's hand, now that I am rich. I will roundly tell her, no. I will make this an opportunity for an edifying display of magnanimity and disinterestedness. I will say, Madam, you have accused me of cupidity. I am now able to prove your injustice. I have been infatuated, as every man must be, by the beauty, grace, and intelligence of Émile Madeleine, and I love her. If she were penniless, my devotion would only be the more ardent. She has been promised to me, and I must insist upon this one article of our agreement. This must be the price of my silence. And, to prove that I am not influenced by her fortune, I give you my sacred promise, that, the day after the wedding, I will send Raoul a stock receipt of 25,000 livres per annum. Louis expressed himself with such convincing candor, that Raoul, an artist in knavery, was charmed and astonished. Beautifully done, he cried, clapping his hands with glee. That last sentence will create a chasm between Madame Fauvel and her niece. The promise of a fortune for me will certainly bring my mother over to our side. I hope so, said Louis with pretended modesty. And I have strong reasons for hoping so, as I shall be able to furnish the good lady with excellent arguments for excusing herself in her own eyes. You know, when someone proposes some little, what shall we call it, transaction to an honest person, it must be accompanied by justification sufficient to quiet all qualms of conscience. I shall prove to Madame Fauvel and her niece that Prosper has shamefully deceived them. I shall prove to them that he is cramped by debts, dissipated, and a reckless gambler, openly associating with a woman of no character. And very pretty, besides, by Jove. You must not neglect to expatiate upon the beauty and fascinations of the adorable gypsy, that will be your strongest point. Don't be alarmed, I shall be more eloquent than a popular divine. Then I will explain to Madame Fauvel that if she really loves her niece, she will persuade her to marry, not an insignificant cashier, but a man of position, a great manufacturer, a marquis, and, more than this, one rich enough to establish you in the world. Raoul was dazzled by this brilliant prospect. If you don't decide her, you will make her waver, he said. Oh! I don't expect a sudden change. I only intend planting the germ in her mind. Thanks to you, it will develop, flourish, and bear fruit. Thanks to me? Allow me to finish. After making my speeches I shall disappear from the scene, and your role will commence. Of course your mother will repeat the conversation to you, and then we can judge of the effect produced. But remember, you must scorn to receive any assistance from me. You must swear that you will brave all privation, want, famine even, rather than accept a cent from a base man whom you hate and despise, a man who, but you know exactly what you are to say. I can rely upon you for good acting. No one can surpass me when I am interested in my part. In pathetic roles I am always a success, when I have had time to prepare myself. I know you are. But this disinterestedness need not prevent you from resuming your dissipations. You must gamble, bet, and lose more money than you ever did before. You must increase your demands, and say that you must have money at all costs. You need not account to me for any money you can extort from her. All you get is your own to spend as you please. You don't say so. If you mean that, you will hurry up matters, I'll be bound. I can promise you, no time shall be wasted. Now listen to what you are to do, Raoul. Before the end of 3 months, you must have exhausted the resources of these 2 women. You must force from them every franc they can raise, so that they will be wholly unable to procure money to supply your increasing demands. In 3 months I must find them penniless, absolutely ruined, without even a jewel left. Raoul was startled at the passionate, vindictive tone of Louis's voice as he uttered these last words. "You must hate these women, if you are so determined to make them miserable," he said. "I hate them," cried Louis. "Can't you see that I madly love Madeleine, love her as only a man of my age can love? Is not her image ever in my mind? Does not the very mention of her name fire my heart, and make me tremble like a schoolboy? Your great devotion does not prevent you planning the destruction of her present happiness. Necessity compels me to do so. Nothing but the most cruel deceptions and the bitterest suffering would ever induce her to become my wife, to take me as the lesser of two evils. The day on which you have led Madame Fauvel and her niece to the extreme edge of the precipice, pointed out its dark depths, and convinced them that they are irretrievably lost, I shall appear, and rescue them. I will play my part with such grandeur, such lofty magnanimity, that Madeleine will be touched, will forget her past enmity, and regard me with favorable eyes. When she finds that it is her sweet self, and not her money, that I want, she will soften, and in time yield to my entreaties. No true woman can be indifferent to a grand passion. I don't pretend to say that she will love me at first, but, if she will only consent to be mine, I ask for nothing more. Time will do much, even for a poor devil like myself." Raoul was shocked at this cold-blooded perversity of his uncle, but Clamart showed his immense superiority in wickedness, and the apprentice admired the master. "You would certainly succeed, uncle," he said, "were it not for the cashier. Between you and Madeleine, Prosper will always stand, if not in person, certainly in memory." Louis smiled scornfully, and, throwing away his cigar, which had died out, said, "I don't mind Prosper, or attach any more importance to him than to that cigar. But she loves him. So much the worse for him. 6 months hence, she will despise him, he is already morally ruined, and at the proper time I will make an end of him socially. Do you know whither the road of dissipation leads, my good nephew? Prosper supports Gypsy, who is extravagant, he gambles, keeps fast horses, and gives suppers. Now, you gamble yourself, and know how much money can be squandered in one night. The losses of baccarat must be paid within 24 hours. He has lost heavily, must pay, and has charge of a money safe." Raoul protested against this insinuation. "It is useless to tell me that he is honest, that nothing would induce him to touch money that does not belong to him. I know better. Parbleu! I was honest myself until I learned to gamble. Any man with a grain of sense would have married Madeleine long ago, and sent us flying bag and baggage. You say she loves him. No one but a coward would be defrauded of the woman he loved and who loved him. Ah, if I had once felt Madeleine's hand tremble in mine, if her rosy lips had once pressed a kiss upon my brow, the whole world could not take her from me. Woe to him who dared stand in my path. As it is, Prosper annoys me, and I intend to suppress him. With your aid I will so cover him with disgrace and infamy, that Madeleine will drive every thought of him from her mind, and her love will turn to hate." Louis's tone of rage and vengeance startled Raoul, and made him regard the affair in a worse light than ever. "You have given me a shameful, dastardly role to play," he said after a long pause. "My honorable nephew has scruples, I suppose," said Clamart sneeringly. "Not exactly scruples, yet I confess." "That you want to retreat? Rather too late to sing that tune, my friend. You wish to enjoy every luxury, have your pockets filled with gold, cut a fine figure in high society, and remain virtuous. Are you fool enough to suppose a poor man can be honest? 'Tis a luxury pertaining to the wealthy. Did you ever see people such as we draw money from the pure fount of virtue? We must fish in muddy waters, and then wash ourselves clean, and enjoy the result of our labor." "I have never been rich enough to be honest," said Raoul humbly. "But I must say it goes hard with me to torture two defenseless, frightened women, and ruin the character of a poor devil who regards me as his best friend. It is a low business. This resistance exasperated Louis to the last degree. "You are the most absurd, ridiculous fool I ever met," he cried. "An opportunity occurs for us to make an immense fortune. All we have to do is to stretch out our hands and take it, when you must needs prove refractory, like a whimpering baby. Nobody but an ass would refuse to drink when he is thirsty, because he sees a little mud at the bottom of the bucket. I suppose you prefer theft on a small scale, stealing by driblets. And where will your system lead you? To the poorhouse or the police station? You prefer living from hand to mouth, supported by Madame Fauvel, having small sums doled out to you to pay your little gambling debts. I am neither ambitious nor cruel. And suppose Madame Fauvel dies tomorrow, what will become of you? Will you go cringing up to the widower, and implore him to continue your allowance?" "Enough said," cried Raoul, angrily interrupting his uncle. "I never had any idea of retreating. I made these objections to show you what infamous work you expect of me, and at the same time prove to you that without my assistance you can do nothing. I never pretended to the contrary. Then, my noble uncle, we might as well settle what my share is to be." "Oh! It is not worth while for you to indulge in idle protestations. What will you give me in case of success? And what if we fail?" "I told you before. I will give you 25,000 livres a year, and all you can secure between now and my wedding day. This arrangement suits me very well. But where are your securities?" This question was discussed a long time before it was satisfactorily settled by the accomplices, who had every reason to distrust each other. "What are you afraid of?" asked Clameron. "Everything," replied Raoul. "Where am I to obtain justice, if you deceive me? From this pretty little poniard? No, thank you. I would be made to pay as dear for your hide, as for that of an honest man." Finally, after long debate and much recrimination, the matter was arranged, and they shook hands before separating. Alas! Madame Fauvel and her niece soon felt the evil effects of the understanding between the villains. Everything happened as Louis had arranged. Once more, when Madame Fauvel had begun to breathe freely, and to hope that her troubles were over, Raoul's conduct suddenly changed. He became more extravagant and dissipated than ever. Formerly, Madame Fauvel would have said, "I wonder what he does with all the money I give him?" Now she saw where it went. Raoul was reckless in his wickedness. He was intimate with actresses, openly lavishing money and jewelry upon them. He drove about with 4 horses, and bet heavily on every race. Never had he been so exacting and exorbitant in his demands for money. Madame Fauvel had the greatest difficulty in supplying his wants. He no longer made excuses and apologies for spending so much. Instead of coaxingly entreating, he demanded money as a right, threatening to betray Madame Fauvel to her husband if she refused him. At this rate, all the possessions of Madame Fauvel and Madeleine soon disappeared. In 1 month, all their money had been squandered. Then they were compelled to resort to the most shameful expedients in the household expenses. They economized in every possible way, making purchases on credit, and making tradesmen wait. Then they changed figures in the bills, and even invented accounts of things never bought. These imaginary costly whims increased so rapidly, that M. Fauvel one day said, as he signed a large check, "Upon my word, ladies, you will buy out all the stores, if you keep on this way. But nothing pleases me better than to see you gratify every wish." Poor women! For months they had bought nothing, but had lived upon the remains of their former splendor, having all their old dresses made over, to keep up appearances in society. More clear-sighted than her aunt, Madeleine saw plainly that the day would soon come when everything would have to be explained. Although she knew that the sacrifices of the present would avail nothing in the future, that all this money was being thrown away without securing her aunt's peace of mind, yet she was silent. A high-minded delicacy made her conceal her apprehensions beneath an assumed calmness. The fact of her sacrificing herself made her refrain from uttering anything like a complaint or censure. She seemed to forget herself entirely in her efforts to comfort her aunt. As soon as Raoul sees we have nothing more to give, she would say, he will come to his senses, and stop all this extravagance. The day came when Madame Fauvel and Madeleine found it impossible to give another franc. The evening previous, Madame Fauvel had a dinner party, and with difficulty scraped together enough money to defray the expenses. Raoul appeared, and said that he was in the greatest need of money, being forced to pay a debt of 2,000 francs at once. In vain they implored him to wait a few days, until they could with propriety ask M. Fauvel for money. He declared that he must have it now, and that he would not leave the house without it. "But I have no way of getting it for you," said Madame Fauvel desperately, "you have taken everything from me. I have nothing left but my diamonds. Do you want them? If they can be of use, take them." Hardened as the young villain was, he blushed at these words. He felt pity for this unfortunate woman, who had always been so kind and indulgent to him, who had so often lavished upon him her maternal caresses. He felt for the noble girl who was the innocent victim of a vile plot. But he was bound by an oath. He knew that a powerful hand would save these women at the brink of the precipice. More than this, he saw an immense fortune at the end of his road of crime, and quieted his conscience by saying that he would redeem his present cruelty by honest kindness in the future. Once out of the clutches of Clamorin, he would be a better man, and try to return some of the kind affection shown him by these poor women. Stifling his better impulses, he said harshly to Madame Fauvel, "Give me the jewels, I will take them to the pawnbrokers." Madame Fauvel handed him a box containing a set of diamonds. It was a present from her husband the day he became worth 1,000,000. And so pressing was the want of these women who were surrounded by princely luxury, with their 10 servants, beautiful blooded horses, and jewels which were the admiration of Paris, that they implored him to bring them some of the money which he would procure on the diamonds, to meet their daily wants. He promised, and kept his word. But they had revealed a new source, a mine to be worked. He took advantage of it. One by one, all Madame Fauvel's jewels followed the way of the diamonds. And, when hers were all gone, those of Madeleine were given up. A recent lawsuit, which showed how a young and beautiful woman had been kept in a state of terror and almost poverty, by a rascal who had possession of her letters. A sad case which no honest man could read without blushing for his sex, has revealed to what depths human infamy can descend. And such abominable crimes are not so rare as people suppose. How many men are supported entirely by stolen secrets, from the coachman who claims 10 louis every month of the foolish girl whom he drove to a rendezvous, to the elegant dandy in light kids, who discovered a financial swindle, and makes the parties interested by his silence, cannot be known. This is called the extortion of hush money, the most cowardly and infamous of crimes, which the law, unfortunately, can rarely overtake and punish. Extortion of hush money, said an old prefect of police, is a trade which supports at least 1,000 scamps in Paris alone. Sometimes we know the blackmailer and his victim, and yet we can do nothing. Moreover, if we were to catch the villain in the very act, and hand him over to justice, the victim, in her fright at the chance of her secret being discovered, would turn against us. It is true, extortion has become a business. Very often it is the business of loafers, who spend plenty of money, when everyone knows they have no visible means of support, and of whom people ask, what do they live upon? The poor victims do not know how easy it would be to rid themselves of their tyrants. The police are fully capable of faithfully keeping secrets confided to them. A visit to the Rue de Jerusalem, a confidential communication with a head of the bureau, who is as silent as a father confessor, and the affair is arranged, without noise, without publicity, without anyone ever being the wiser. There are traps for master extortioners, which work well in the hands of the police. Madame Fauvel had no defense against the scoundrels who were torturing her, save prayers and tears. These availed her little. Sometimes Madame Fauvel betrayed such heartbroken suffering when Raoul begged her for money which she had no means of obtaining, that he would hurry away disgusted at his own brutal conduct. and say to Clamaran, "You must end this dirty business. I cannot stand it any longer. I will blow any man's brains out, or fight a crowd of cutthroats, if you choose. But as to killing by agony and fright these two poor miserable women, whom I am really fond of, I am not going to do it. You ask for more than I can do. I am not quite the cowardly hound you take me for." Clamaran paid no attention to these remonstrances. Indeed, he was prepared for them. "It is not pleasant, I know," he replied. "But necessity knows no law. Have a little more perseverance and patience, we have almost got to the end." The end was nearer than Clamaran supposed. Toward the latter part of November, Madame Fauvel saw that it was impossible to postpone the catastrophe any longer, and as a last effort determined to apply to the Marquis for assistance. She had not seen him since his return from Oloron, except once, when he came to announce his accession to wealth. At that time, persuaded that he was the evil genius of Raoul, she had received him very coldly, and did not invite him to repeat his visit. She hesitated about speaking to her niece of the step she intended taking, because she feared violent opposition. To her great surprise, Madeleine warmly approved of it. Trouble had made her keen-sighted and suspicious. Reflecting on past events, comparing and weighing every act and speech of Raoul, she was now convinced that he was Clamaran's tool. She thought that Raoul was too shrewd to be acting in this shameful way, ruinously to his own interests, if there were not some secret motive at the bottom of it all. She saw that this persecution was more feigned than real. So thoroughly was she convinced of this, that, had it only concerned herself alone, she would have firmly resisted the oppression, certain that the threatened exposure would never take place. Recalling, with a shudder, certain looks of Clamaran, she guessed the truth, that the object of all this underhand work was to force her to become his wife. Determined on making the sacrifice, in spite of her repugnance toward the man, she wished to have the deed done at once. Anything was preferable to this terrible anxiety, to the life of torture which Raoul made her lead. She felt that her courage might fail if she waited and suffered much longer. "The sooner you see M. de Clamaran the better for us, aunt," she said, after talking the project over. The next day Madame Fauvel called on the Marquis at the Hôtel du Louvre, having sent him a note announcing her intended visit. He received her with cold, studied politeness, like a man who had been misunderstood and had been unjustly wounded. After listening to her report of Raoul's scandalous behavior, he became very indignant, and swore that he would soon make him repent of his heartlessness. But when Madame Fauvel told of the immense sums of money forced from her, Clamaran seemed confounded, as if he could not believe it. "The worthless rascal," he exclaimed, "the idea of his audacity! Why, during the last 4 months, I have given him more than 20,000 francs, which I would not have done except to prevent him from applying to you, as he constantly threatened to do." Seeing an expression of doubtful surprise upon Madame Fauvel's face, Louis arose, and took from his desk some receipts signed by Raoul. The total amount was 23,500 francs. Madame Fauvel was shocked and amazed. "He has obtained 40,000 francs from me," she faintly said, "so that altogether he has spent 60,000 francs in 4 months. "I can't imagine what he does with it," said Clamaran, "unless he spends it on actresses. Good heavens! What can these creatures do with all the money lavished on them?" "That is a question I cannot answer, madam." He appeared to pity Madame Fauvel sincerely. He promised that he would at once see Raoul, and reason with him about the shameful life he was leading. Perhaps he could be persuaded to reform. Finally, after many protestations of friendship, he wound up by placing his fortune at her disposal. Although Madame Fauvel refused his offer, she appreciated the kindness of it, and on returning home said to Madeleine, "Perhaps we have mistaken his character, he may be a good man after all." Madeleine sadly shook her head. She had anticipated just what happened. Clamaran's magnanimity and generosity confirmed her presentiments. Raoul came to see his uncle, and found him radiant. "Everything is going on swimmingly, my smart nephew," said Clamaran. your receipts acted like a charm. Ah, you are a partner worth having. I congratulate you upon your success. 40,000 francs in 4 months. Yes, said Raoul carelessly. I got about that much from pawnbrokers. Pests. Then you must have a nice little sum laid by. That is my business, uncle, and not yours. Remember our agreement. I will tell you this much, Madame Fauvel and Madeleine have turned everything they could into money. They have nothing left, and I have had enough of my role. Your role is ended. I forbid you to hereafter ask for a single centime. What are you about to do? What has happened? The mine is loaded, nephew, and I am awaiting an opportunity to set fire to it. Louis de Clameren relied upon making his rival, Prosper Bertomy, furnish him this ardently desired opportunity. He loved Madeleine too passionately to feel aught save the bitterest hate toward the man whom she had freely chosen, and who still possessed her heart. Clameren knew that he could marry her at once if he chose, but in what way? By holding a sword of terror over her head, and forcing her to be his. He became frenzied at the idea of possessing her person, while her heart and soul would always be with Prosper. Thus he swore that, before marrying, he would so cover Prosper with shame and ignominy that no honest person would speak to him. He had first thought of killing him, but, fearing that Madeleine would enshrine and worship his memory, he determined to disgrace him. He imagined that there would be no difficulty in ruining the unfortunate young man. He soon found himself mistaken. Though Prosper led a life of reckless dissipation, he preserved order in his disorder. If in a state of miserable entanglement, and obliged to resort to all sorts of makeshifts to escape his creditors, his caution prevented the world from knowing it. Vainly did Raoul, with his pockets full of gold, try to tempt him to play high. Every effort to hasten his ruin failed. When he played he did not seem to care whether he lost or won. Nothing aroused him from his cold indifference. His friend Nina Gypsy was extravagant, but her devotion to Prosper restrained her from going beyond certain limits. Raoul's great intimacy with Prosper enabled him to fully understand the state of his mind, that he was trying to drown his disappointment in excitement, but had not given up all hope. You need not hope to beguile Prosper into committing any piece of folly, said Raoul to his uncle, his head is as cool as a usurer's. He never goes beyond a certain degree of dissipation. What object he has in view I know not. Perhaps, when he has spent his last Napoleon, he will blow his brains out, he certainly never will descend to any dishonorable act. As to tampering with the money safe entrusted to his keeping, we must force him on, replied Clameren, lead him into extravagances, make Gypsy call on him for costly finery. Lend him plenty of money. Raoul shook his head, as if convinced that his efforts would be vain. You don't know Prosper, uncle, we can't galvanize a dead man. Madeleine killed him the day she discarded him. He takes no interest in anything on the face of the earth. We can wait and see. They did wait, and, to the great surprise of Madame Fauvel, Raoul once more became an affectionate and dutiful son, as he had been during Clameren's absence. From reckless extravagance he changed to great economy. Under pretext of saving money, he remained at Vézenet, although it was very uncomfortable and disagreeable there in the winter. He said he wished to expiate his sins in solitude. The truth was, that, by remaining in the country, he ensured his liberty, and escaped his mother's visits. It was about this time that Madame Fauvel, charmed with the improvement in Raoul, asked her husband to give him some employment. M. Fauvel was delighted to please his wife, and at once offered Raoul the place of corresponding clerk with a salary of 500 francs a month. The appointment pleased Raoul. But, in obedience to Clameren's command, he refused it, saying his vocation was not banking. This refusal so provoked the banker, that he told Raoul, if he was so idle and lazy, not to call on him for money again, or expect him to do anything to assist him. Raoul seized this pretext for ostensibly ceasing his visits. When he wanted to see his mother, he would come in the afternoon, when he knew that M. Fauvel would be from home. And he only came often enough to keep informed of what was going on in the household. This sudden lull after so many storms appeared ominous to Madeleine. She was more certain than ever that the plot was now ripe, and would suddenly burst upon them, without warning. She did not impart her presentiment to her aunt, but prepared herself for the worst. "What can they be doing?" Madame Fauvel would say. "Can they have ceased to persecute us?" "Yes, what can they be doing?" Madeleine would murmur. Louis and Raoul gave no signs of life, because, like expert hunters, they were silently hiding, and watching for a favorable opportunity of pouncing upon their victims. Never losing sight of Prosper for a day, Raoul had exhausted every effort of his fertile mind to compromise his honor, to ensnare him into some inextricable entanglement. But, as he had foreseen, the cashier's indifference offered little hope of success. Clameron began to grow impatient at this delay, and had fully determined to bring matters to a crisis himself, when one morning, about 3 o'clock, he was aroused by Raoul. He knew that some event of great importance must have happened, to make his nephew come to his house at this hour of the morning. "What is the matter?" he anxiously inquired. "Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. I have just left Prosper." "Well?" "I had him, Madame Gypsy, and 3 other friends to dine with me. After dinner, I made up a game of baccarat, but Prosper took no interest in it, although he was quite tipsy." "You must be drunk yourself to come here waking me up in the middle of the night, to hear this idle gabble," said Louis angrily. "What the devil do you mean by it? Now, don't be in a hurry. Wait until you hear the rest. Morbleu. Speak, then." "After the game was over, we went to supper. Prosper became intoxicated, and betrayed the secret name with which he closes the money safe." At these words Clameron uttered a cry of triumph. "What was the word?" "The name of his friend." "Gypsy." "Yes, that would be 5 letters. Louis was so excited that he jumped out of bed, slipped on his dressing gown, and began to stride up and down the chamber. "Now we have got him," he said with vindictive satisfaction. "There's no chance of escape for him now. Ah, the virtuous cashier won't touch the money confided to him, so we must touch it for him. The disgrace will be just as great, no matter who opens the safe. We have the word, you know where the key is kept." "Yes, when M. Fauvel goes out he always leaves the key in the drawer of his secretary, in his chamber." "Very good. Go and get this key from Madame Fauvel. If she does not give it up willingly, use force, so that you get it, that is the point, then open the safe, and take out every franc it contains. Ah, Master Bertomy, you shall pay dear for being loved by the woman whom I love." For 5 minutes Clameron indulged in such a tirade of abuse against Prosper, mingled with rhapsodies of love for Madeleine, that Raoul thought him almost out of his mind. "Before crying victory," he said, "you had better consider the drawbacks and difficulties. Prosper might change the word tomorrow." "Yes, he might, but it is not probable he will. He will forget what he said while drunk. Besides, we can hasten matters. That is not all. M. Fauvel has given orders that no large sum shall be kept in the safe overnight. Before closing the bank everything is sent to the Bank of France. A large sum will be kept there the night I choose." "You think so?" "I think this. I have 100,000 crowns deposited with M. Fauvel, and if I desire the money to be paid over to me early some morning, directly the bank is opened, of course the money will be kept in the safe the previous night." "A splendid idea!" cried Raoul admiringly. It was a good idea, and the plotters spent several hours in studying its strong and weak points. Raoul feared that he would never be able to overcome Madame Fauvel's resistance. And, even if she yielded the key, would she not go directly and confess everything to her husband? She was fond of Prosper, and would hesitate a long time before sacrificing him. But Louis felt no uneasiness on this score. "One sacrifice necessitates another," he said, she has made too many to draw back at the last one. She sacrificed her adopted daughter. Therefore she will sacrifice a young man, who is, after all, a comparative stranger to her. But Madame will never believe any harm of Prosper, she will always have faith in his honor. Therefore, you talk like an idiot, my verdant nephew. Before the conversation had ended, the plan seemed feasible. The scoundrels made all their arrangements, and fixed the day for committing the crime. They selected the evening of the 7th of February, because Raoul knew that M. Fauvel would be at a bank director's dinner, and Madeleine was invited to a party on that evening. Unless something unforeseen should occur, Raoul knew that he would find Madame Fauvel alone at 8:30. "I will ask M. Fauvel this very day," said Clameron, "to have my money on hand for Tuesday." "That is a very short notice, uncle," objected Raoul. "You know there are certain forms to be gone through, and he can claim a longer time wherein to pay it over." "That is true, but our banker is proud of always being prepared to pay any amount of money, no matter how large. And if I say I am pressed, and would like to be accommodated on Tuesday, he will make a point of having it ready for me. Now, you must ask Prosper, as a personal favor to you, to have the money on hand at the opening of the bank." Raoul once more examined the situation, to discover if possible a grain of sand which might be converted into a mountain at the last moment. "Prosper and Gypsy are to be at Vézenet this evening," he said, "but I cannot ask them anything until I know the banker's answer. As soon as you arrange matters with him, send me word by Manuel." "I can't send Manuel, for an excellent reason, he has left me, but I can send another messenger." Louis spoke the truth, Manuel was gone. He had insisted on keeping Gaston's old servant in his service, because he thought it imprudent to leave him at Oloron, where his gossiping might cause trouble. He soon became annoyed by Manuel's loyalty, who had shared the perils and good fortunes of an excellent master for many years, and determined to rid himself of this last link which constantly reminded him of Gaston. The evening before, he had persuaded Manuel to return to Arenys-de-Mer, a little port of Catalonia, his native place, and Louis was looking for another servant. After breakfasting together, they separated. Clameron was so elated by the prospect of success, that he lost sight of the great crime intervening. Raoul was calm, but resolute. The shameful deed he was about to commit would give him riches, and release him from a hateful servitude. His one thought was liberty, as Louis's was Madeleine. Everything seemed to progress finely. The banker did not ask for the notice of time, but promised to pay the money at the specified hour. Prosper said he would have it ready early in the morning. The certainty of success made Louis almost wild with joy. He counted the hours, and the minutes, which passed but too slowly. "When this affair is ended," he said to Raoul, "I will reform and be a model of virtue. No one will dare hint that I have ever indulged in any sins, great or small." But Raoul became more and more sad as the time approached. Reflection gradually betrayed the blackness of the contemplated crime. Raoul was bold and determined in the pursuit of his own gratifications and wickedness. He could smile in the face of his best friend, while cheating him of his last Napoleon at cards. And he could sleep well after stabbing his enemy in the heart, but he was young. He was young in sin. Vice had not yet penetrated to his marrow bones, corruption had not yet crowded into his soul enough to uproot and destroy every generous sentiment. It had not been so very long since he had cherished a few holy beliefs. The good intentions of his boyhood were not quite obliterated from his sometimes reproachful memory. Possessing the daring courage natural to youth, he despised the cowardly part forced upon him. This dark plot, laid for the destruction of two helpless women, filled him with horror and disgust. His heart revolted at the idea of acting the part of Judas toward his mother to betray her between two kisses. Disgusted by the cool villainy of Louis, he longed for some unexpected danger to spring up, some great peril to be braved, so as to excuse himself in his own eyes. To give him the spirit to carry through the scheme. For he would like to reap the benefits without doing the revolting work. But no, He well knew that he ran no risk, not even that of being arrested and sent to the galleys. For he was certain that, if M. Fauvel discovered everything, he would do his best to hush it up, to conceal every fact connected with the disgraceful story which would implicate his wife. Although he was careful not to breathe it to Clameron, he felt a sincere affection for Madame Fauvel, and was touched by the indulgent fondness which she so unchangingly lavished upon him. He had been happy at Vézenet, while his accomplice, or rather his master, was at Oloron. He would have been glad to lead an honest life, and could not see the sense of committing a crime when there was no necessity for it. He hated Clameron for not consenting to let the matter drop, now that he was rich enough to live in affluence the rest of his life, and who, for the sake of gratifying a selfish passion, was abusing his power, and endangering the safety and happiness of so many people. He longed for an opportunity of thwarting his plots, if it could be done without also ruining himself. His resolution, which had been so firm in the beginning, was growing weaker and weaker as the hours rolled on. As the crisis approached, his horror of the deed increased. Seeing this uncertain state of Raoul's mind, Louis never left him, but continued to paint for him a dazzling future, position, wealth, and freedom. Possessing a large fortune, he would be his own master, gratify his every wish, and make amends to his mother for his present undutiful conduct. He urged him to take pride in acting his part in this little comedy, which would soon be over without doing harm to anyone. He prepared, and forced his accomplice to rehearse, the scene which was to be enacted at Madame Fauvel's, with as much coolness and precision as if it were to be performed at a public theatre. Louis said that no piece could be well acted unless the actor was interested and imbued with the spirit of his role. But the more urgently Louis pressed upon him the advantages to be derived from success, the oftener he sounded in his ears the magic words, 500,000 francs. The more loudly did Raoul's conscience cry out against the sinful deed. On Monday evening, about 6 o'clock, Raoul felt so depressed and miserable, that he had almost made up his mind to refuse to move another step, and to tell Louis that he must find another tool to carry out his abominable plot. "Are you afraid?" asked Clameron, who had anxiously watched these inward struggles. "Yes, I am afraid. I am not cursed with your ferocious nature and iron will. I am the most miserable dog living. Come, cheer up, my boy. You are not yourself today. Don't fail me at the last minute, when everything depends upon you. Just think that we have almost finished. One more stroke of our oars, and we are in port. You are only nervous. Come to dinner, and a bottle of Burgundy will soon set you right." They were walking along the boulevard. Clameron insisted upon their entering a restaurant, and having dinner in a private room. Vainly did he strive, however, to chase the gloom from Raoul's pale face. He sat listening, with a sullen frown, to his friend's jests about swallowing the bitter pill gracefully. Urged by Louis, he drank 2 bottles of wine, in hopes that intoxication would inspire him with courage to do the deed, which Clameron impressed upon his mind must and should be done before many more hours had passed over his head. But the drunkenness he sought came not, the wine proved false. At the bottom of the last bottle he found disgust and rage. The clock struck 8. "The time has come," said Louis firmly. Raoul turned livid, his teeth chattered, and his limbs trembled so that he was unable to stand on his feet. "Oh, I cannot do it," he cried in an agony of terror and rage. Clameron's eyes flashed with angry excitement at the prospect of all his plans being ruined at the last moment. But he dared not give way to his anger, for fear of exasperating Raoul, whom he knew to be anxious for an excuse to quarrel, so he quietly pulled the bell rope. A boy appeared. "A bottle of port," he said, "and a bottle of rum." When the boy returned with the bottles, Louis filled a goblet with the 2 liquors mixed, and handed it to Raoul. "Drink this," he said in a tone of command. Raoul emptied the glass at one draught, and a faint color returned to his ashy cheeks. He arose, and snatching up his hat, cried fiercely, "Come along." But before he had walked half a square, the factitious energy inspired by drink deserted him. He clung to Clameron's arm, and was almost dragged along in the direction of the banker's house, trembling like a criminal on his way to the scaffold. If I can once get him in the house, thought Louis, and make him begin, the excitement of his mother's opposition will make him carry it through successfully. The cowardly baby! I would like to wring his neck. Although his breast was filled with these thoughts and fears, he was careful to conceal them from Raoul, and said soothingly, "Now, don't forget our arrangement. And be careful how you enter the house. Everything depends upon your being unconcerned and cool, to avoid arousing suspicion in the eyes of anyone you may meet. Have you a pistol in your pocket?" "Yes, yes. Let me alone." It was well that Clameron had accompanied Raoul, for, when he got in sight of the door, his courage gave way, and he longed to retreat. A poor, helpless woman, he groaned, and an honest man who pressed my hand in friendship yesterday, to be cowardly ruined, betrayed by me. Ah, it is too base. I cannot. Come, don't be a coward. I thought you had more nerve. Why, you might as well have remained virtuous and honest. You will never earn your salt in this sort of business. Raoul overcame his weakness, and, silencing the clamors of his conscience, rushed up the steps, and pulled the bell furiously. "Is Madame Fauvel at home?" he inquired of the servant who opened the door. "Madame is alone in the sitting-room adjoining her chamber," was the reply. Raoul went upstairs. Chapter 20. Clameron's last injunction to Raoul was, "Be very cautious when you enter the room, your appearance must tell everything, so you can avoid preliminary explanations." The recommendation was useless. The instant that Raoul went into the little salon, the sight of his pale, haggard face and wild eyes caused Madame Fauvel to spring up with clasped hands, and cry out, "Raoul! What has happened? Speak, my son." The sound of her tender, affectionate voice acted like an electric shock upon the young bandit. He shook like a leaf. But at the same time his mind seemed to change. Louis was not mistaken in his estimate of his companion's character. Raoul was on the stage, his part was to be played. His assurance returned to him, his cheating, lying nature assumed the ascendant, and stifled any better feeling in his heart. "This misfortune is the last I shall ever suffer, mother." Madame Fauvel rushed toward him, and, seizing his hand, gazed searchingly into his eyes, as if to read his very soul. "What is the matter? Raoul, my dear son, do tell me what troubles you." He gently pushed her from him. "The matter is, my mother," he said in a voice of heartbroken despair, "that I am an unworthy, degenerate son. Unworthy of you, unworthy of my noble father." She tried to comfort him by saying that his errors were all her fault, and that he was, in spite of all, the pride of her heart. "Alas," he said, "I know and judge myself. No one can reproach me for my infamous conduct more bitterly than does my own conscience. I am not naturally wicked, but only a miserable fool. At times I am like an insane man, and am not responsible for my actions. Ah, my dear mother, would not be what I am, if you had watched over my childhood. But brought up among strangers, with no guide but my own evil passions, nothing to restrain me, no one to advise me, no one to love me, owning nothing, not even my stolen name. I am cursed with vanity and unbounded ambition. Poor, with no one to assist me but you, I have the tastes and vices of a millionaire's son. Alas for me! When I found you, the evil was done. Your affection, your maternal love, the only true happiness of my life, could not save me. I, who had suffered so much, endured so many privations, even the pangs of hunger, became spoiled by this new life of luxury and pleasure which you opened before me. I rushed headlong into extravagance, as a drunkard long deprived of liquor seizes and drains to the dregs the first bottle in his reach. Madame Fauvel listened, silent and terrified, to these words of despair and remorse, which Raoul uttered with vehemence. She dared not interrupt him, but felt certain some dreadful piece of news was coming. Raoul continued in a sad, hopeless tone. Yes, I have been a weak fool. Happiness was within my reach, and I had not the sense to stretch forth my hand and grab it. I rejected a heavenly reality to eagerly pursue a vain phantom. I, who ought to have spent my life at your feet, and daily striven to express my gratitude for your lavish kindness, have made you unhappy, destroyed your peace of mind, and, instead of being a blessing, I have been a curse ever since the first fatal day you welcomed me to your kind heart. Ah, unfeeling brute that I was, to squander upon creatures whom I despised, a fortune, of which each gold piece must have cost you a tear. Too late, too late. With you I might have been a good and happy man. He stopped, as if overcome by the conviction of his evil deeds, and seemed about to burst into tears. It is never too late to repent, my son, murmured Madame Fauvel in comforting tones. Ah, if I only could, cried Raoul, but no, it is too late. Besides, can I tell how long my good resolutions will last? This is not the first time that I have condemned myself pitilessly. Stinging remorse for each new fault made me swear to lead a better life, to sin no more. What was the result of these periodical repentances? At the first temptation I forgot my remorse and good resolutions. I am weak and mean-spirited, and you are not firm enough to govern my vacillating nature. While my intentions are good, my actions are villainous. The disproportion between my extravagant desires, and the means of gratifying them, is too great for me to endure any longer. Who knows to what fearful lengths my unfortunate disposition may lead me? However, I will take my fate in my own hands, he finally said with a reckless laugh. Oh, Raoul, my dear son, cried Madame Fauvel in an agony of terror, explain these dreadful words, am I not your mother? Tell me what distresses you, I am ready to hear the worst. He appeared to hesitate, as if afraid to crush his mother's heart by the terrible blow he was about to inflict. Then in a voice of gloomy despair he replied. I am ruined. Ruined? Yes, ruined, and I have nothing more to expect or hope for. I am dishonored, and all through my own fault, no one is to be blamed but myself. Raoul. It is the sad truth, my poor mother. But fear nothing, I shall not trail in the dust the name which you bestowed upon me. I will at least have the courage not to survive my dishonor. Come, mother, don't pity me, or distress yourself. I am one of those miserable beings fated to find no peace save in the arms of death. I came into the world with misfortune stamped upon my brow. Was not my birth a shame and disgrace to you? Did not the memory of my existence haunt you day and night, filling your soul with remorse? And now, when I am restored to you after many years' separation, do I not prove to be a bitter curse instead of a blessing? Ungrateful boy! Have I ever reproached you? Never. Your poor Raoul will die with your beloved name on his lips, his last words a prayer to heaven to heap blessings upon your head, and reward your long-suffering devotion. Die? You die, my son. It must be, my dear mother, honor compels it. I am condemned by judges from whose decision no appeal can be taken, my conscience and my will. An hour ago, Madame Fauvel would have sworn that Raoul had made her suffer all the torments that a woman could endure, but now she felt that all her former troubles were nothing compared with her present agony. My God! Raoul, what have you been doing? Money was entrusted to me, I gambled and lost it. Was it a large sum? No, but more than I can replace. My poor mother, have I not taken everything from you? Did you not give me your last jewel? But M. de Clameren is rich. He placed his fortune at my disposal. I will order the carriage, and go to him. But M. de Clameren is absent, and will not return to Paris until next week, and if I do not have the money this evening, I am lost. Alas! I have thought deeply, and, although it is hard to die so young, still fate wills it so. He pulled a pistol from his pocket, and, with a forced smile, said, "This will settle everything." "Madame." Fauvel was too excited and frightened to reflect upon the horror of Raoul's behavior, and that these wild threats were a last resort for obtaining money. Forgetful of the past, careless of the future, her every thought concentrated upon the present, she comprehended but one fact, that her son was about to commit suicide. And that she was powerless to prevent the fearful deed. "Oh, wait a little while, my son," she cried. "André will soon return home, and I will ask him to give me, how much did you lose?" 30,000 francs. "You shall have them tomorrow." "But I must have the money tonight." Madame Fauvel wrung her hands in despair. "Oh! Why did you not come to me sooner, my son? Why did you not have confidence enough in me to come at once for help? This evening. There is no one in the house to open the money safe. If it were not for that, if you had only come before André went out." "The safe!" cried Raoul, with sudden joy, as if this magic word had thrown a ray of light upon his dark despair. "Do you know where the key is kept?" "Yes, it is in the next room." "Well," he exclaimed, with a bold look that caused Madame Fauvel to lower her eyes, and keep silent. "Give me the key, mother," he said in a tone of entreaty. "Oh, Raoul, Raoul! It is my life I am asking of you." These words decided her. She snatched up a candle, rushed into her chamber, opened the secretary, and took out M. Fauvel's key. But, when about to hand it to Raoul, she seemed to suddenly see the enormity of what she was doing. "Oh, Raoul! My son," she murmured, "I cannot. Do not ask me to commit such a dreadful deed." He said nothing, but sadly turned to leave the room, then coming back to his mother said, "Ah, well, it makes but little difference in the end. At least, you will give me one last kiss, before we part forever, my darling mother." "What could you do with the key, Raoul?" interrupted Madame Fauvel. "You do not know the secret word of the buttons." "No, but I can try to open it without moving the buttons. You know that money is never kept in the safe overnight. Nevertheless, I can make the attempt. If I open the safe, and find money in it, it will be a miracle, showing that heaven has pitied my misfortune and provided relief. And if you are not successful, will you promise me to wait until tomorrow, to do nothing rash tonight?" "I swear it, by my father's memory." "Then take the key and follow me." Pale and trembling, Raoul and Madame Fauvel passed through the banker's study, and down the narrow staircase leading to the offices and cash-room below. Raoul walked in front, holding the light, and the key of the safe. Madame Fauvel was convinced that it would be utterly impossible to open the safe, as the key was useless without the secret word, and of course Raoul had no way of discovering what that was. Even granting that some chance had revealed the secret to him, he would find but little in the safe, since everything was deposited in the Bank of France. Everyone knew that no large sum was ever kept in the safe after banking hours. The only anxiety she felt was, how Raoul would bear the disappointment, and how she could calm his despair. She thought that she would gain time by letting Raoul try the key, and then, when he could not open the safe, he would keep his promise, and wait until the next day. There was surely no harm in letting him try the lock, when he could not touch the money. When he sees there is no chance of success, she thought, he will listen to my entreaties. And tomorrow. What she could do tomorrow she knew not, she did not even ask herself. But in extreme situations the least delay inspires hope, as if a short respite meant sure salvation. The condemned man, at the last moment, begs for a reprieve of a day, an hour, a few seconds. Raoul was about to kill himself. His mother prayed to God to grant her one day, not even a day, one night, as if in this space of time some unexpected relief would come to end her misery. They reached Prosper's office, and Raoul placed the light on a high stool so that it lighted the whole room. He then summoned up all his coolness, or rather that mechanical precision of movement, almost independent of will, of which men accustomed to peril avail themselves in time of need. Rapidly, with the dexterity of experience, he slipped the buttons on the 5 letters composing the name of G, Y, P, S, Y. His features, during this short operation, expressed the most intense anxiety. He was fearful that his nervous energy might give out, of not being able to open the safe, of not finding the money there when he opened it, of Prosper having changed the word, or perhaps having neglected to leave the money in the safe. Madame Fauvel saw these visible apprehensions with alarm. She read in his eyes that wild hope of a man who, passionately desiring an object, ends by persuading himself that his own will suffices to overcome all obstacles. Having often been present when Prosper was preparing to leave his office, Raoul had 50 times seen him move the buttons, and lock the safe, just before leaving the bank. Indeed, having a practical turn of mind, and an eye to the future, he had even tried to lock the safe himself on several occasions, while waiting for Prosper. He inserted the key softly, turned it around, pushed it farther in, and turned it a second time, then thrust it in suddenly, and turned it again. His heart beat so loudly that Madame Fauvel could hear its throbs. The word had not been changed, the safe opened. Raoul and his mother simultaneously uttered a cry, she of terror, he of triumph. "Shut it again," cried Madame Fauvel, frightened at the incomprehensible result of Raoul's attempt. "Come away. Don't touch anything, for heaven's sake. Raoul." And, half frenzied, she clung to Raoul's arm, and pulled him away so abruptly, that the key was dragged from the lock, and, slipping along the glossy varnish of the safe door, made a deep scratch some inches long. But at a glance Raoul discovered, on the upper shelf of the safe, 3 bundles of banknotes. He snatched them up with his left hand, and slipped them inside his vest. Exhausted by the effort she had just made, Madame Fauvel dropped Raoul's arm, and, almost fainting with emotion, clung to the back of a chair. "Have mercy, Raoul," she moaned. "I implore you to put back that money, and I solemnly swear that I will give you twice as much tomorrow. Oh, my son, have pity upon your unhappy mother." He paid no attention to these words of entreaty, but carefully examined the scratch on the safe. He was alarmed at this trace of the robbery, which it was impossible for him to cover up. "At least you will not take all," said Madame Fauvel, "just keep enough to save yourself, and put back the rest." "What good would that do? The discovery will be made that the safe has been opened. So I might as well take all as a part." "Oh, no. Not at all. I can account to André, I will tell him I had a pressing need for a certain sum, and opened the safe to get it." In the meantime Raoul had carefully closed the safe. "Come, mother, let us go back to the sitting room. A servant might go there to look for you, and be astonished at our absence." Raoul's cruel indifference and cold calculations at such a moment filled Madame Fauvel with indignation. She saw that she had no influence over her son, that her prayers and tears had no effect upon his hard heart. "Let them be astonished," she cried, "let them come here and find us. I will be relieved to put an end to this tissue of crime. Then André will know all, and drive me from his house. Let come what will, I shall not sacrifice another victim. Prosper will be accused of this theft tomorrow. Clamoran defrauded him of the woman he loved, and now you would deprive him of his honor. I will have nothing to do with so base a crime." She spoke so loud and angrily that Raoul was alarmed. He knew that the errand boy slept in a room close by, and might be in bed listening to her, although it was early in the evening. "Come upstairs," he said, seizing Madame Fauvel's arm. But she clung to a table and refused to move a step. "I have been cowardly enough to sacrifice Madeleine," she said, "but I will not ruin Prosper." Raoul had an argument in reserve which he knew would make Madame Fauvel submit to his will. "Now, really," he said with a cynical laugh, "do you pretend that you do not know Prosper and I arranged this little affair together, and that he is to have half the booty? Impossible. I never will believe such a thing of Prosper. Why, how do you suppose I discovered the secret word? Who do you suppose disobeyed orders, and left the money in the safe? Prosper is honest. Of course he is, and so am I too. The only thing is, that we both need money. You are telling a falsehood, Raoul. Upon my soul, I am not. Madeleine rejected Prosper, and the poor fellow has to console himself for her cruelty, and these sorts of consolations are expensive, my good mother. He took up the candle, and gently but firmly led Madame Fauvel toward the staircase. She mechanically suffered herself to be led along, more bewildered by what she had just heard than she was at the opening of the safe door. What, she gasped, can Prosper be a thief? She began to think herself the victim of a terrible nightmare, and that, when she waked, her mind would be relieved of this intolerable torture. She helplessly clung to Raoul's arm as he helped her up the narrow little staircase. You must put the key back in the secretary, said Raoul, as soon as they were in the chamber again. But she did not seem to hear him, so he went and replaced the safe key in the place from which he had seen her take it. He then led, or rather carried, Madame Fauvel into the little sitting room, and placed her in an easy chair. The set, expressionless look of the wretched woman's eyes, and her dazed manner, frightened Raoul, who thought that she had lost her mind. That her reason had finally given way beneath this last terrible shock. Come, cheer up, my dear mother, he said in coaxing tones as he rubbed her icy hands, you have saved my life, and rendered an immense service to Prosper. Don't be alarmed. Everything will come out right in the end. Prosper will be accused, perhaps arrested, he expects that, and is prepared for it, he will deny his culpability. And, as there is no proof against him, he will be set at liberty immediately. But these falsehoods were wasted on Madame Fauvel, who was incapable of understanding anything said to her. Raoul, she moaned in a broken-hearted tone, Raoul, my son, you have killed me. Her gentle voice, kind even in its despairing accents, touched the very bottom of Raoul's perverted heart, and once more his soul was wrung by remorse. So that he felt inclined to put back the stolen money, and comfort the despairing woman whose life and reason he was destroying. The thought of Clameron restrained him. Finding his efforts to restore Madame Fauvel fruitless, that, in spite of all his affectionate regrets and promises, she still sat silent, motionless, and deathlike, and fearing that M. Fauvel or Madeleine might enter at any moment, and demand an explanation, he hastily pressed a kiss upon his mother's brow, and hurried from the house. At the restaurant, in the room where they had dined, Clameron, tortured by anxiety, awaited his accomplice. He wondered if at the last moment, when he was not near to sustain him, Raoul would prove a coward, and retreat, if any unforeseen trifle had prevented his finding the key. If any visitors were there, and, if so, would they depart before M. Fauvel's return from the dinner party? He had worked himself into such a state of excitement, that, when Raoul returned, he flew to him with ashy face and trembling all over, and could scarcely gasp out. Well? The deed is done, uncle, thanks to you, and I am now the most miserable, abject villain on the face of the earth. He unbuttoned his vest, and, pulling out the 4 bundles of banknotes, angrily dashed them upon the table, saying, in a tone of scorn and disgust, now I hope you are satisfied. This is the price of the happiness, honor, and perhaps the life of 3 people. Clameron paid no attention to these angry words. With feverish eagerness he seized the notes, and rattled them in his hand as if to convince himself of the reality of success. Now Madeleine is mine, he cried excitedly. Raoul looked at Clameron in silent disgust. This exhibition of joy was a shocking contrast to the scene in which he had just been an actor. He was humiliated at being the tool of such a heartless scoundrel as he now knew Clameron to be. Louis misinterpreted this silence, and said gaily, "Did you have much difficulty?" "I forbid you ever to allude to this evening's work," cried Raoul fiercely. "Do you hear me? I wish to forget it." Clameron shrugged his shoulders at this outburst of anger, and said in a bantering tone, "Just as you please, my handsome nephew, I rather think you will want to remember it though." when I offer you these 350,000 francs. You will not, I am sure, refuse to accept them as a slight souvenir. Take them, they are yours." This generosity seemed neither to surprise nor satisfy Raoul. "According to our agreement," he said sullenly, "I was to have more than this. Of course, this is only part of your share. And when am I to have the rest, if you please?" "The day I marry Madeleine, and not before, my boy. You are too valuable an assistant to lose at present. And you know that, though I don't mistrust you, I am not altogether sure of your sincere affection for me." Raoul reflected that to commit a crime, and not profit by it, would be the height of absurdity. He had come with the intention of breaking off all connection with Clameron. But he now determined that he would not abandon his accomplice until he had been well paid for his services. "Very well," he said, "I accept this on account. But remember, I will never do another piece of work like this tonight." "You can do what you please, I shall flatly refuse." Clameron burst into a loud laugh, and said, "That is sensible, now that you are rich, you can afford to be honest. Set your conscience at rest, for I promise you I will require nothing more of you save a few trifling services. You can retire behind the scenes now, while I appear upon the stage, my role begins." Chapter 21. For more than an hour after Raoul's departure, Madame Fauvel remained in a state of stupor bordering upon unconsciousness. Gradually, however, she recovered her senses sufficiently to comprehend the horrors of her present situation, and, with the faculty of thought, that of suffering returned. The dreadful scene in which she had taken part was still before her affrighted vision. All the attending circumstances, unnoticed at the time, now struck her forcibly. She saw that she had been the dupe of a shameful conspiracy, that Raoul had tortured her with cold-blooded cruelty, had taken advantage of her tenderness, and had speculated upon her fright. But had Prosper anything to do with the robbery? This Madame Fauvel had no way of finding out. Ah, Raoul knew how the blow would strike when he accused Prosper. He knew that Madame Fauvel would end by believing in the cashier's complicity. The unhappy woman sat and thought over every possible way in which Raoul could find out the secret word without Prosper's knowledge. She rejected with horror the idea that the cashier was the instigator of the crime, but, in spite of herself, it constantly recurred. And finally she felt convinced that what Raoul said must be true. For who but Prosper could have betrayed the word? And who but Prosper could have left so large an amount of money in the safe, which, by order of the banker, was to be always left empty at night? Knowing that Prosper was leading a life of extravagance and dissipation, she thought it very likely that he had, from sheer desperation, resorted to this bold step to pay his debts. Her blind affection, moreover, made her anxious to attribute the crime to anyone, rather than to her darling son. She had heard that Prosper was supporting one of those worthless creatures whose extravagance impoverishes men, and whose evil influence perverts their natures. When a young man is thus degraded, will he stop at any sin or crime? Alas! Madame Fauvel knew, from her own sad experience, to what depths even one fault can lead. Although she believed Prosper guilty, she did not blame him, but considered herself responsible for his sins. Had she not herself banished the poor young man from the fireside which he had begun to regard as his own? Had she not destroyed his hopes of happiness, by crushing his pure love for a noble girl, whom he looked upon as his future wife, and thus driven him into a life of dissipation and sin? She was undecided whether to confide in Madeleine, or bury the secret in her own breast. Fatally inspired, she decided to keep silent. When Madeleine returned home at 11 o'clock, Madame Fauvel not only was silent as to what had occurred, but even succeeded in so concealing all traces of her agitation, that she escaped any questions from her niece. Her calmness never left her when M. Fauvel and Lucien returned, although she was in terror lest her husband should go down to the cash-room to see that everything was safely locked up. It was not his habit to open the money safe at night, but he sometimes did. As fate would have it, the banker, as soon as he entered the room, began to speak of Prosper, saying how distressing it was that so interesting a young man should be thus throwing himself away. And wondering what could have happened to make him suddenly cease his visits at the house, and resort to bad company. If M. Fauvel had looked at the faces of his wife and niece while he harshly blamed the cashier, he would have been puzzled at their strange expressions. All night long Madame Fauvel suffered the most intolerable agony. She counted each stroke of the town clock, as the hours dragged on. In 6 hours, she said to herself, in 5 hours, in 4 hours, in 3 hours, in 1 hour, all will be discovered, and then what will happen? Heaven help me. At sunrise she heard the servants moving about the house. Then the office shutters opened, then, later, she heard the clerks going into the bank. She attempted to get up, but felt so ill and weak that she sank back on her pillow, and lying there, trembling like a leaf, bathed in cold perspiration, she awaited the discovery of the robbery. She was leaning over the side of the bed, straining her ear to catch a sound from the cash room, when Madeleine, who had just left her, rushed into the room. The white face and wild eyes of the poor girl told Madame Fauvel that the crime was discovered. "Do you know what has happened, aunt?" cried Madeleine, in a shrill, horrified tone. "Prosper is accused of robbery, and the police have come to take him to prison." A groan was Madame Fauvel's only answer. "Raoul or the Marquis is at the bottom of this," continued Madeleine excitedly. "How can they be concerned in it, my child? I can't tell yet, but I only know that Prosper is innocent. I have just seen him, spoken to him. He would never have looked me in the face had he been guilty." Madame Fauvel opened her lips to confess all, fear kept her silent. "What can these wretches want?" said Madeleine. "What new sacrifice do they demand?" "Dishonor Prosper." "Good heavens! Why did they not kill him at once? He would rather be dead than disgraced." Here the entrance of M. Fauvel interrupted Madeleine. The banker was so angry that he could scarcely speak. "The worthless scoundrel," he cried, "to think of his daring to accuse me. To insinuate that I robbed my own safe. And that Marquis de Clameren must needs doubt my good faith in keeping my engagement to pay his money." Then, without noticing the effect of his story upon the two women, he proceeded to relate all that had occurred downstairs. "I was afraid this extravagance would lead to something terrible," he said in conclusion. "You know I told you last night that Prosper was growing worse in his conduct, and that he would get into trouble." Throughout the day Madeleine's devotion to her aunt was severely tried. The generous girl saw disgrace heaped upon the man she loved. She had perfect faith in his innocence, she felt sure she knew who had laid the trap to ruin him. And yet she could not say a word in his defense. Fearing that Madeleine would suspect her of complicity in the theft, if she remained in bed and betrayed so much agitation, Madame Fauvel arose and dressed for breakfast. It was a dreary meal. No one tasted a morsel. The servants moved about on their tiptoes, as silently as if a death had occurred in the family. About 2 o'clock, a servant came to M. Fauvel's study, and said that the Marquis de Clameren desired to see him. "What?" cried the banker. "Does he dare?" Then, after a moment's reflection, he added, "Ask him to walk up." The very name of Clameren had sufficed to arouse all the slumbering wrath of M. Fauvel. The victim of a robbery, finding his safe empty at the moment that he was called upon to make a heavy payment, he had been constrained to conceal his anger and resentment. But now he determined to have his revenge upon his insolent visitor. But the Marquis declined to come upstairs. The messenger returned with the answer that the gentleman had a particular reason for seeing M. Fauvel in the office below, where the clerks were. "What does this fresh impertinence mean?" cried the banker, as he angrily jumped up and hastened downstairs. M. de Clameren was standing in the middle of the room adjoining the cash room. M. Fauvel walked up to him, and said bluntly, "What do you want now, monsieur? You have been paid your money, and I have your receipt." To the surprise of all the clerks, and the banker himself, the Marquis seemed not in the least offended at this rude greeting, but answered in a deferential but not at all humble manner. "You are hard upon me, monsieur. But I deserve it, and that is why I am here. A gentleman always acknowledges when he is in the wrong. In this instance I am the offender. And I flatter myself that my past will permit me to say so without being accused of cowardice or lack of self-respect. I insisted upon seeing you here instead of in your study, because, having been rude to you in the presence of your clerks, I wished them to hear me apologize for my behavior of this morning." Clameron's speech was so different from his usual overbearing, haughty conduct, that surprise almost stupefied the banker, and he could only answer, "I must say that I was hurt by your doubts. Insinuations, suspicions of my honor. This morning," continued the Marquis, "I was irritated, and thoughtlessly gave way to my temper. Although I am grey-headed, my disposition is as excitable as that of a fiery young man of 20 years, and I hope you will forget words uttered in a moment of excitement, and now deeply regretted." M. Fauvel, being a kind-hearted though quick-tempered man, could appreciate Clameron's feelings. And, knowing that his own high reputation for scrupulous honesty could not be affected by any hasty or abusive language uttered by a creditor, at once calmed down before so frank an apology. And, holding out his hand to Clameron, said, "Let us forget what happened, monsieur." They conversed in a friendly manner for some minutes. And, after Clameron had explained why he had such pressing need of the money at that particular hour of the morning, turned to leave, saying that he would do himself the honor of calling upon Madame Fauvel during the day. "That is, if a visit from me would not be considered intrusive," he said with a shade of hesitation. "Perhaps, after the trouble of this morning, she does not wish to be disturbed." "Oh, no," said the banker, "come, by all means. I think a visit from you would cheer her mind. I shall be from home all day, trying to trace this unfortunate affair." Madame Fauvel was in the same room where Raoul had threatened to kill himself the night previous. She looked very pale and ill as she lay on a sofa. Madeleine was bathing her forehead. When M. de Clameron was announced, they both started up as if a phantom had appeared before them. Although Louis had been gay and smiling when he parted from M. Fauvel downstairs, he now wore a melancholy aspect, as he gravely bowed, and refused to seat himself in the chair which Madame Fauvel motioned him to take. "You will excuse me, ladies, for intruding at this time of your affliction, but I have a duty to fulfill." The two women were silent. They seemed to be waiting for him to explain. He added in an undertone, "I know all." By an imploring gesture, Madame Fauvel tried to stop him. She saw that he was about to reveal her secret to Madeleine. But Louis would not see this gesture. He turned his whole attention to Madeleine, who haughtily said, "Explain yourself, monsieur." "Only 1 hour ago," he replied, "I discovered that Raoul last night forced from his mother the key of the money safe, and stole 350,000 francs. Madeleine crimsoned with shame and indignation. She leaned over the sofa, and seizing her aunt's wrist shook it violently, and in a hollow voice cried, "It is false, is it not, aunt? Speak." "Alas! Alas!" groaned Madame Fauvel. "What have I done?" "You have allowed Prosper to be accused," cried Madeleine. "You have suffered him to be arrested, and disgraced for life." "Forgive me," sighed Madame Fauvel. "He was about to kill himself, I was so frightened." "Then you know, Prosper was to share the money, he gave Raoul the secret word." "Good heavens! Aunt, how could you believe such a falsehood as that?" Clameron interrupted them. "Unfortunately, what your aunt says of M. Bertomy is the truth," he said in a sad tone. "Your proofs, monsieur. Where are your proofs?" "Raoul's confession. Raoul is false." "That is only too true, but how did he find out the word, if M. Bertomy did not reveal it? And who left the money in the safe but M. Bertomy?" These arguments had no effect upon Madeleine. "And now tell me," she said scornfully, "what became of the money?" There was no mistaking the significance of these words. They meant, "You are the instigator of the robbery, and of course you have taken possession of the money." This harsh accusation from a girl whom he so passionately loved, when, grasping bandit as he was, he gave up for her sake all the money gained by his crime, so cruelly hurt Clameron that he turned livid. But his mortification and anger did not prevent him from pursuing the part he had prepared and studied. "A day will come, mademoiselle," he said, "when you will deeply regret having treated me so cruelly. I understand your insinuation, you need not attempt to deny it." "I have no idea of denying anything, monsieur." "Madeline," remonstrated Madame Fauvel, who trembled at the rising anger of the man who held her fate in his hands, "Madeline, be careful." "Mademoiselle is pitiless," said Clameron sadly, "she cruelly punishes an honorable man whose only fault is having obeyed his brother's dying injunctions. And I am here now, because I believe in the joint responsibility of all the members of a family." Here he slowly drew from his pocket several bundles of banknotes, and laid them on the mantelpiece. "Raoul stole 350,000 francs, he said, I return the same amount. It is more than half my fortune. Willingly would I give the rest to ensure this being the last crime committed by him." Too inexperienced to penetrate this bold, and yet simple plan of Clameron's, Madeline was dumb with astonishment, all her calculations were upset. Madame Fauvel, on the contrary, accepted this restitution as salvation sent from heaven. "Oh, thanks, monsieur, thanks," she cried, gratefully clasping Clameron's hand in hers, "you are goodness itself." Louis's eye lit up with pleasure. But he rejoiced too soon. A minute's reflection brought back all of Madeline's distrust. She thought this magnanimity and generosity unnatural in a man whom she considered incapable of a noble sentiment, and at once concluded that it must conceal some snare beneath. "What are we to do with the money?" she demanded. "Restore it to M. Fauvel, mademoiselle." "We restore it, monsieur, and how?" "Restoring the money is denouncing Raoul, and ruining my aunt." "Take back your money, monsieur." "We will not touch it." Clameron was too shrewd to insist. He took up the money, and prepared to leave. "I comprehend your refusal, mademoiselle, and must find another way of accomplishing my wish. But, before retiring, let me say that your injustice pains me deeply. After the promise you made to me, I had reason to hope for a kinder welcome. I will keep my promise, monsieur, but not until you have furnished security." "Security? And for what? Pray, explain yourself." "Something to protect my aunt against the molestations of Raoul after my marriage." "What is to prevent his coming to extort money from his mother after he has squandered my dowry? A man who spends 100,000 francs in 4 months will soon run through my little fortune. We are making a bargain. I give you my hand in exchange for the honor and life of my aunt, and of course you must give me some guarantee to secure the performance of your promise." "Oh! I will give you ample securities," cried Clameron, "such as will quiet all your suspicious doubts of my good faith." "Alas! You will not believe in my devotion. What shall I do to convince you of its sincerity? Shall I try to save M. Bertomy?" "Thanks for the offer, monsieur," replied Madeline disdainfully. "If Prosper is guilty, let him be punished by the law. If he is innocent, God will protect him." Here Madeline stood up, to signify that the interview was over. Clameron bowed, and left the room. What pride! What determination! The idea of her demanding securities of me, he said to himself as he slowly walked away. But the proud girl shall be humbled yet. She is so beautiful. And, if I did not so madly love her, would kill her on the spot. Never had Clameron been so irritated. Madeline's quiet determination and forethought had unexpectedly thrown him off his well-laid track. Not anticipating any such self-assertion on her part, he was disconcerted, and at a loss how to proceed. He knew that it would be useless to attempt deceiving a girl of Madeline's character a second time. He saw that she had penetrated his motive sufficiently to put her on the defensive, and prepare her for any new surprise. Moreover, she would prevent Madame Fauvel from being frightened and forced into submission any longer. With mortification and rage, Louis saw that after all his plotting, when success was in his reach, when his hopes were almost crowned, he had been foiled and scornfully set at defiance by a girl. The whole thing would have to be gone over again. Although Madeleine had resigned herself to sacrifice, it was still evident that she had no idea of doing so blindly, and would not hazard her aunt's and her own happiness upon the uncertainty of a verbal promise. Clameron racked his brain to furnish guarantees. How could he convince her that Raoul had no idea or desire of annoying Madame Fauvel in the future? He could not tell Madeleine that her dowry was to be the bribe received by Raoul for his future good behavior and past crimes. The knowledge of all the circumstances of this shameful criminal intrigue would have reassured her upon her aunt's peace of mind. But then it would never do to inform her of these details, certainly not before the marriage. What securities could he give? Not one could he think of. But Clameron was not one of those slow-minded men who take weeks to consider a difficulty. When he could not untie a knot, he would cut it. Raoul was a stumbling block to his wishes, and he swore to rid himself of his troublesome accomplice as soon as possible. Although it was not an easy matter to dispose of so cunning a knave, Clameron felt no hesitation in undertaking to accomplish his purpose. He was incited by one of those passions which age renders terrible. The more certain he was of Madeleine's contempt and dislike, the more determined he was to marry her. His love seemed to be a sort of insane desire to possess and call his own the one being whom he recognized as his superior in every way. But he had sense enough to see that he might ruin his prospects by undue haste, and that the safest course would be to await the result of the robbery and its effect upon Prosper. He waited in anxious expectation of a summons from Madame Fauvel. At last he concluded that Madeleine was waiting for him to make the next move in the direction of yielding. He was right. Madeleine knew that after the last bold step the accomplices would remain quiet for a while. She knew resistance could have no worse results than would cowardly submission, and therefore assumed the entire responsibility of managing the affair so as to keep at bay both Raoul and Clameron. She knew that Madame Fauvel would be anxious to accept any terms of peace, but she determined to use all her influence to prevent her doing this, and to force upon her the necessity of preserving a dignified silence. This accounted for the silence of the two women, who were quietly waiting for their adversaries to renew hostilities. They even succeeded in concealing their anxiety beneath assumed indifference, never asking any questions about the robbery, or those in any way connected with it. M. Fauvel brought them an account of Prosper's examination, the many charges brought against him, his obstinate denial of having stolen the money, and finally how, after great perplexity and close study of the case by the judge of instruction, the cashier had been discharged for want of sufficient proof against him. Since Clameron's offer to restore the notes, Madame Fauvel had not doubted Prosper's guilt. She said nothing, but inwardly accused him of having seduced her son from the path of virtue, and enticed him into crime, her son whom she would never cease to love, no matter how great his faults. Madeleine had perfect faith in Prosper's innocence. She was so confident of his being restored to liberty that she ventured to ask her uncle, under pretext of some charitable object, to give her 10,000 francs, which she sent to the unfortunate victim of circumstantial evidence, who, from what she had heard of his poverty, must be in need of assistance. In the letter, cut from her prayer book to avoid detection by writing, accompanying the money, she advised Prosper to leave France, because she knew that it would be impossible for a man of his proud nature to remain on the scene of his disgrace. The greater his innocence, the more intolerable his suffering. Besides, Madeleine, at that time feeling that she would be obliged to marry Clameron, was anxious to have the man she loved far, far away from her. On the day that this anonymous present was sent, in opposition to the wishes of Madame Fauvel, the two poor women were entangled fearfully in pecuniary difficulties. The tradesman whose money had been squandered by Raoul refused to give credit any longer, and insisted upon their bills being paid at once, saying they could not understand how a man of M. Fauvel's wealth and position could keep them waiting for such insignificant sums. The butcher, grocer, and wine merchant had bills of 1, 2, and 500 francs only. But, not having even that small amount, Madame Fauvel had difficulty in prevailing upon them to receive a part on account, and wait a little longer for the residue. Some of the storekeepers threatened to ask the banker for their money, if everything was not settled before the end of the week. Alas! Madame Fauvel's indebtedness amounted to 15,000 francs. Madeleine and her aunt had declined all invitations during the winter, to avoid purchasing evening dresses. Having always been remarkable for their superb toilets, seldom appearing in the same ball dress twice, they dared not give rise to comment by wearing their old dresses, and knowing that M. Fauvel would be the first to ask the cause of this sudden change, as he liked to see them always the best-dressed women in the room. But at last they were obliged to appear in public. M. Fauvel's most intimate friends, the Messrs. Jean Didier, were about to give a splendid ball, and, as fate would have it, a fancy ball, which would require the purchasing of costumes. Where would the money come from? They had been owing a large bill to their dressmaker for over a year. Would she consent to furnish them dresses on credit? They were ashamed to ask her. Madeleine's new maid, Palmyre Choqueril, extricated them from this difficulty. This girl, who seemed to have suffered all the minor ills of life, which, after all, are the hardest to bear, seemed to have divined her mistress's anxiety. At any rate, she voluntarily informed Madeleine that a friend of hers, a first-class dressmaker, had just set up for herself, and would be glad to furnish materials and make the dresses on credit. For the sake of obtaining the patronage of Madame Fauvel and her niece, which would at once bring her plenty of fashionable customers. But, after this dilemma was settled, a still greater one presented itself. Madame Fauvel and her niece could not appear at a ball without jewelry, and every jewel they owned had been taken by Raoul, and pawned. After thinking the matter over, Madeleine decided to ask Raoul to take some of the stolen money, and redeem the last set of jewels he had forced from his mother. She informed her aunt of her intention, and said, in a tone that admitted of no contradiction, "Appoint an interview with Raoul, he will not dare to refuse you, and I will go in your stead." The next day, the courageous girl took a cab, and, regardless of the inclement weather, went to Vézenet. She would have been filled with consternation had she known that M. Vergeret and Prosper were following close behind, and witnessed her interview from the top of a ladder. Her bold step was fruitless. Raoul swore that he had divided with Prosper, that his own half of the money was spent, and that he had not a Napoleon wherewith to redeem anything. He even refused to give up the pledges. And Madeleine had to resort to threats of exposure, before she could induce him to surrender the tickets of 4 or 5 trifling articles that were indispensable to their toilet. Clameron had ordered him to refuse positively to give up a single ticket, because he hoped that in their distress they would call upon him for relief. The violent altercation witnessed by Clameron's new valet, Joseph Dubois, had been caused by the exaction of this promise. The accomplices were at that time on very bad terms. Clameron was seeking a safe means of getting rid of Raoul, and the young scamp, having a presentiment of his uncle's intentions, was determined to outwit him. Nothing but the certainty of impending danger could reconcile them. The danger was revealed to them both at the Jean Didier ball. Who was the mysterious mountebank that indulged in such transparent allusions to Madame Fauvel's private troubles, and then said, with threatening significance to Louis, "I was the best friend of your brother Gaston"? Who he was, where he came from, they could not imagine. But they clearly saw that he was a dangerous enemy, and forthwith attempted to assassinate him upon his leaving the ball. Having been followed and watched by their would-be victim, they became alarmed, especially when he suddenly disappeared, and wisely decided that the safest thing they then could do was to return quietly to their hotel. "We cannot be too guarded in our conduct," whispered Clameron, "we must discover who he is before taking any further steps in this matter." Once more, Raoul tried to induce him to give up his project of marrying Madeleine. "Never," he exclaimed fiercely, "I will marry her or perish in the attempt." He thought that, now they were warned, the danger of being caught was lessened. When on his guard, few people could entrap so experienced and skillful a rogue. Little did Cameron know that a man who was 100-fold more skillful than he was closely pursuing him. Chapter 22. The Catastrophe. Such are the facts that, with an almost incredible talent for investigation, had been collected and prepared by the stout man with the jovial face who had taken Prosper under his protection, M. Vergeret. Reaching Paris at 9 o'clock in the evening, not by the Lyons Road as he had said, but by the Orleans train, M. Vergeret hurried up to the Archangel, where he found the cashier impatiently expecting him. "You are about to hear some rich developments," he said to Prosper, "and see how far back into the past one has to seek for the primary cause of a crime. All things are linked together and dependent upon each other in this world of ours. If Gaston de Clameren had not entered a little café at Tarascon to play a game of billiards 20 years ago, your money safe would not have been robbed 3 weeks ago. Valentine de la Verberie is punished in 1866 for the murder committed for her sake in 1840. Nothing is neglected or forgotten, when stern retribution asserts her sway. Listen." And he forthwith related all that he had discovered, referring, as he went along, to a voluminous manuscript which he had prepared, with many notes and authenticated proofs attached. During the last week M. Vergeret had not had 24 hours rest, but he bore no traces of fatigue. His iron muscles braved any amount of labor, and his elastic nature was too well tempered to give way beneath such pressure. While any other man would have sunk exhausted in a chair, he stood up and described, with the enthusiasm and captivating animation peculiar to him, the minutest details and intricacies of the plot that he had devoted his whole energy to unraveling. Personating every character he brought upon the scene to take part in the strange drama, so that his listener was bewildered and dazzled by his brilliant acting. As Prosper listened to this narrative of events happening 20 years back, the secret conversations as minutely related as if overheard the moment they took place, it sounded more like a romance than a statement of plain facts. All these ingenious explanations might be logical, but what foundation did they possess? Might they not be the dreams of an excited imagination? M. Vergeret did not finish his report until 4 o'clock in the morning. Then he cried, with an accent of triumph, "And now they are on their guard, and sharp, wary rascals too, but they won't escape me, I have cornered them beautifully. Before a week is over, Prosper, you will be publicly exonerated, and will come out of this scrape with flying colors. I have promised your father you shall." "Impossible," said Prosper in a dazed way, "it cannot be." "What? All this you have just told me?" M. Vergeret opened wide his eyes, as if he could not understand anyone having the audacity to doubt the accuracy of his report. "Impossible, indeed," he cried. "What? Have you not sense enough to see the plain truth written all over every fact, and attested by the best authority? Your thick-headedness exasperates me to the last degree. But how can such rascalities take place in Paris, in our very midst, without—" "Parbleu," interrupted the fat man, "you are young, my friend. Are you innocent enough to suppose that crimes, 40 times worse than this, don't occur every day? You think the horrors of the police court are the only ones? Pooh! You only read in the Gazette de Tribunaux of the cruel melodramas of life, where the actors are as cowardly as the knife, and as treacherous as the poison they use. It is at the family fireside, often under shelter of the law itself, that the real tragedies of life are acted. In modern crimes the traitors wear gloves, and cloak themselves with public position. The victims die, smiling to the last, without revealing the torture they have endured to the end. Why, what I have just related to you is an everyday occurrence, and you profess astonishment. I can't help wondering how you discovered all this tissue of crime." "Ah, that is the point," said the fat man with a self-satisfied smile. When I undertake a task, I devote my whole attention to it. Now, make a note of this: when a man of ordinary intelligence concentrates his thoughts and energies upon the attainment of an object, he is certain to obtain ultimate success. Besides that, I have my own method of working up a case. Still, I don't see what grounds you had to go upon. To be sure, one needs some light to guide one in a dark affair like this. But the fire in Clameron's eye at the mention of Gaston's name ignited my lantern. From that moment I walked straight to the solution of the mystery, as I would walk to a beacon light on a dark night. The eager, questioning look of Prosper showed that he would like to know the secret of his protector's wonderful penetration, and at the same time be more thoroughly convinced that what he had heard was all true, that his innocence would be more clearly proved. "Now confess," cried M. Vergeret, "you would give anything in the world to find out how I discovered the truth?" "I certainly would, for it is the darkest of mysteries, marvelous." M. Vergeret enjoyed Prosper's bewilderment. To be sure, he was neither a good judge nor a distinguished amateur. But he was an astonished admirer, and sincere admiration is always flattering, no matter whence it comes. "Well," he replied, "I will explain my system. There is nothing marvelous about it, as you will soon see. We worked together to find the solution of the problem, so you know my reasons for suspecting Clameron as the prime mover in the robbery. As soon as I had acquired this certainty, my task was easy. You want to know what I did? I placed trustworthy people to watch the parties in whom I was most interested. Joseph Dubois took charge of Clameron, and Nina Gypsy never lost sight of Madame Fauvel and her niece. I cannot comprehend how Nina ever consented to this service." "That is my secret," replied M. Vergeret. Having the assistance of good eyes and quick ears on the spot, I went to Beaucaire to inquire into the past, so as to link it with what I knew of the present. The next day I was at Clameron, and the first step I took was to find the son of Saint Jean, the old valet. An honest man he was, too, open and simple as nature herself. And he made a good bargain in selling me his matter. "Matter?" said Prosper with a puzzled look. "What did you?" "Of course I wanted to buy his matter. Of course I did not appear to him as I do to you now. I was a countryman wanting to buy matter, he had matter for sale, so we began to bargain about the price. The debate lasted almost all day, during which time we drank a dozen bottles of wine. About supper-time, St. Jean was as drunk as a bunghole, and I had purchased 900 francs worth of matter which your father will sell tomorrow." Prosper's astonished countenance made M. Vergeret laugh heartily. "I risked 900 francs, he continued, but thread by thread I gathered the whole history of the Clamerons, Gaston's love affair, his flight, and the stumbling of the horse ridden by Louis. I found also that about a year ago Louis returned, sold the chateau to a man named Fougerix, whose wife, Mihan, had a secret interview with Louis the day of the purchase. I went to see Mihan. Poor woman! Her rascally husband has pounded all the sense out of her, she is almost idiotic. I told her I came from the Clameron family, and she at once related to me everything she knew." The apparent simplicity of this mode of investigation confounded Prosper. He wondered it had not occurred to him before. "From that time," continued M. Vergeret, "the skein began to disentangle. I held the principal thread. I now set about finding out what had become of Gaston. Lafourcade, who is a friend of your father, informed me that he had bought a foundry, and settled in Oloron, where he soon after suddenly died. 36 hours later I was at Oloron." "You are certainly indefatigable," said Prosper. "No, but I always strike while the iron is hot. At Oloron I met Manuel, who had gone there to make a little visit before returning to Spain. From him I obtained a complete history of Gaston's life, and all the particulars of his death. Manuel also told me of Louis's visit. And the innkeeper described a young workman who was there at the same time, whom I at once recognized as Raoul." "But how did you know of all the conversations between the villains?" said Prosper. You seem to be aware of their secret thoughts. You evidently think I have been drawing upon my imagination. You will soon see to the contrary, said Verduret good-humoredly. While I was at work down there, my aides did not sit with their hands tied together. Mutually distrustful, Clamaran and Raoul preserved all the letters received from each other. Joseph Dubois copied them, or the important portions of them, and forwarded them to me. Nina spent her time listening at all doors under her supervision, and sent me a faithful report. Finally, I have at the Fauvilles another means of investigation which I will reveal to you later. I understand it all now, murmured Prosper. And what have you been doing during my absence, my young friend? Asked M. Verduret. Have you heard any news? At this question Prosper turned crimson. But he knew that it would never do to keep silent about his imprudent step. Alas, he stammered, I read in a newspaper that Clamaran was about to marry Madeleine, and I acted like a fool. What did you do? Inquired Verduret anxiously. I wrote an anonymous letter to M. Fauvel, informing him that his wife was in love with Raoul. M. Verduret here brought his clenched fist down upon the little table nearby, with such violence that the thin plank was shivered. His cheerful face in an instant clouded over. What folly! He exclaimed, how could you go and ruin everything? He arose from his seat, and strode up and down the room, oblivious of the lodgers below, whose windows shook with every angry stamp of his foot. What made you act so like a child, an idiot, a fool? He said indignantly to Prosper. Monsieur! Here you are, drowning. An honest man springs into the water to save you, and just as he approaches the shore you entangle his feet to prevent him from swimming. What was my last order to you when I left here? To keep quiet, and not go out of the hotel. Well. The consciousness of having done a foolish thing made Prosper appear like a frightened schoolboy, accused by his teacher of playing truant. It was night, monsieur, he hesitatingly said, and, having a violent headache, I took a walk along the quay thinking there was no risk in my entering a café. There I picked up a paper, and read the dreadful announcement. Did you not promise to trust everything to me? You were absent, monsieur. And you yourself might have been surprised by an unexpected. Only fools are ever surprised into committing a piece of folly, cried M. Verduret impatiently. To write an anonymous letter. Do you know to what you expose me? Breaking a sacred promise made to one of the few persons whom I highly esteem among my fellow beings. I shall be looked upon as a liar, a cheat, I who. He abruptly stopped, as if afraid to trust himself to speak further. After calming down a little, he turned to Prosper, and said. The best thing we can do is to try and repair the harm you have done. When and where did you post this idiotic letter? Yesterday evening, at the Rue du Cardinal Lemoyne. It hardly reached the bottom of the box before I regretted having written it. You had better have regretted it before dropping it in. What time was it? About 10 o'clock. Then your sweet little letter must have reached M. Fauvel with his early mail. Probably he was alone in his study when he read it. I know he was. He never goes down to the bank until he has opened his letters. Can you recall the exact terms of your letter? Stop and think, for it is very important that I should know. Oh, it is unnecessary for me to reflect. I remember the letter as if I had just written it. And almost verbatim he repeated what he had written. After attentively listening, M. Verduret sat with a perplexed frown upon his face, as if trying to discover some means of repairing the harm done. That is an awkward letter, he finally said, to come from a person who does not deal in such things. It leaves everything to be understood without specifying anything. It is vague, jeering, insidious. Repeat it to me. Prosper obeyed, and his second version did not vary from the first in a single word. Nothing could be more alarming than that allusion to the cashier, said the fat man, repeating the words after Prosper. The question, was it also he who stole Madame Fauvel's diamonds? Is simply fearful. What could be more exasperating than the sarcastic advice, in your place, I would not have any public scandal, but would watch my wife. The effect of your letter must have been terrible, he added thoughtfully as he stood with folded arms looking at poor Prosper. M. Fauvel is quick-tempered, is he not? He has a violent temper, when aroused. Then the mischief is not irreparable. What do you suppose? I think that an impulsive man is afraid of himself, and seldom carries out his first angry intentions. That is our chance of salvation. If, upon the receipt of your bombshell, M. Fauvel, unable to restrain himself, rushed into his wife's room, and cried, "Where are your diamonds?" Madame Fauvel will confess all, and then goodbye to our hopes. Why would this be disastrous? Because, the moment Madame Fauvel opens her lips to her husband, our birds will take flight. Prosper had never thought of this eventuality. Then, again, continued M. Vergeret, it would deeply distress another person. Anyone whom I know? Yes, my friend, and very well too. I should certainly be chagrined to the last degree, if these two rascals escape, without having obtained complete satisfaction from them. It seems to me that you know how to take care of yourself, and can do anything you please. M. Vergeret shrugged his shoulders, and said, "Did you not perceive the gaps in my narrative?" "I did not." "That is because you don't know how to listen. In the first place, did Louis de Clamron poison his brother, or not?" "Yes, I am sure of it, from what you tell me." "There you are. You are much more certain, young man, than I am. Your opinion is mine, but what proof have we?" "None." I skillfully questioned Dr. C. He has not the shadow of suspicion, and Dr. C. is no quack. He is a cultivated, observing man of high standing. What poisons produce the effects described? I know of none, and yet I have studied up on poisons from Pomerania digitalis to Souveracy aconite. The death took place so opportunely that anybody would be convinced of foul play. That is true, but chance is sometimes a wonderful accomplice in crime. In the second place, I know nothing of Raoul's antecedents. Is information on that point necessary? Indispensable, my friend, but we will soon know something. I have sent off one of my men, excuse me, I mean one of my friends, who is very expert in adroit, palate, and he writes that he is on the track. I am interested in the history of this sentimental, skeptical young rascal. I have an idea that he must have been a brave, honest sort of youth before Clamron ruined him. Prosper was no longer listening. M. Vergeret's words had inspired him with confidence. Already he saw the guilty men arraigned before the bar of justice. And enjoyed, in anticipation, this assize court drama, where he would be publicly exonerated and restored to position. Then he would seek Madeline. For now he understood her strange conduct at the dressmaker's, and knew that she had never ceased to love him. This certainty of future happiness restored all the self-possession that had deserted him the day he found the safe robbed. For the first time he was astonished at the peculiarity of his situation. Prosper had at first only been surprised at the protection of M. Vergeret and the extent of his investigations. Now he asked himself, what could have been his motives for acting thus? What price did he expect for this sacrifice of time and labor? His anxiety made him say nervously, "It is unjust to us both, monsieur, for you to preserve your incognito any longer. When you have saved the honor and life of a man, you should at least let him know whom he is to thank for it." "Oh," said M. Vergeret smilingly, "you are not out of the woods yet. You are not married either, so you must wait a little longer, patience and faith." The clock struck 6. "Good heavens!" exclaimed M. Vergeret. "Can it be 6 o'clock? I did hope to have a good night's rest, but I must keep on moving. This is no time to be asleep." He went into the passage, and, leaning over the balusters, called, "Madame Alexander." "I say, Madame Alexander." The hostess of the Archangel, the portly wife of Fanferlot the squirrel, evidently had not been to bed. This fact struck Prosper. She appeared, obsequious, smiling, and eager to please. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" she inquired. "You can send your Joseph Dubois and Palmyre to me as soon as possible. Let me know when they arrive. I will rest a few minutes, and you can awake me when they come." As soon as Madame Alexander left the room, the fat man unceremoniously threw himself on the bed. "You have no objections, I suppose?" he said to Prosper. In 5 minutes he was fast asleep, and Prosper sat by the bed watching him with a perplexed gaze, wondering who this strange man could be. About 9 o'clock someone tapped timidly at the door. Slight as the noise was, it aroused M. Vergeret, who sprang up, and called out. "Who is it?" Prosper arose and opened the door. Joseph Dubois, the valet of the Marquis of Clamart, entered. This important assistant of M. Vergeret was breathless from fast running, and his little rat eyes were more restless than ever. "Well, patron, I am glad to see you once more," he cried. "Now you can tell me what to do. I have been perfectly lost during your absence, and have felt like a jumping monkey with a broken string." "What? Did you get frightened too?" "Bless me. I think I had cause for alarm when I could not find you anywhere. Yesterday afternoon I sent you 3 dispatches, to the addresses you gave me, Lyons, Beaucaire, and Oloron, but received no answer. I was almost crazy with anxiety when your message reached me just now. Things are getting hot, then." "Hot? They are burning. The place is too warm to hold me any longer. Upon my soul, I can't stand it." M. Vergeret occupied himself in repairing his toilet, become disarranged by lying down. When he had finished, he threw himself in an easy chair, and said to Joseph Dubois, who remained respectfully standing, cap in hand, like a soldier awaiting orders. "Explain yourself, my boy. And quickly, if you please. No circumlocution. It is just this, patron. I don't know what your plans are, or what line you are taking now. But I can just tell you this, that you will have to wind up the affair pretty quickly." "That is your opinion, Master Joseph?" "Yes, patron, because if you wait any longer, goodbye to our covey, you will certainly find an empty cage, and the birds flown." "You smile?" "Yes, I know you are clever, and can accomplish anything. But they are cunning blades, and as slippery as eels. They know that they are watched, too." "The devil they do," cried M. Vergeret. "Who has been committing blunders?" "Oh. Nobody has done anything wrong," replied Joseph. "You know, patron, that they suspected something long ago. They gave you a proof of it, the night of the fancy ball. That ugly cut on your arm was the beginning. Ever since, they have had one eye open all the time. They had begun to feel easier, when all of a sudden, yesterday, ma foi, they began to smell a rat. Was that the cause of your telegrams?" "Of course. Now listen, yesterday morning when my master got up, about 10 o'clock, he took it into his head to arrange the papers in his desk. Which, by the way, has a disgusting lock which has given me a deal of trouble. Meanwhile, I pretended to be fixing the fire, so as to remain in the room to watch him. Patron, the man has an eye like a Yankee. At the first glance he saw, or rather divined, that his papers had been meddled with. He turned livid, and swore an oath. Lord, what an oath! Never mind the oath, go on." "Well, how he discovered the little attentions I had devoted to his letters, I can't imagine. You know how careful I am. I had put everything in perfect order. Just as I found things I left them, when, lo and behold, my noble Marquis picks up each paper, one at a time, turns it over, and smells it. I was just thinking I would offer him a magnifying glass, when all of a sudden he sprang up, and with one kick sent his chair across the room, and flew at me with his eyes flashing like 2 pistols. 'Somebody has been at my papers,' he shrieked, 'this letter has been photographed.' Error. I am not a coward, but I can tell you that my heart stood perfectly still. I saw myself as dead as Caesar, cut into mincemeat, and says I to myself, Fanfer, excuse me, Du Bois, my friend, you are lost, dead, and I thought of Madame Alexander. M. Vergeret was buried in thought, and paid no attention to the worthy Joseph's analysis of his personal sensations. What happened next? Said Vergeret after a few minutes. Why, he was just as frightened as I was, patron. The rascal did not even dare to touch me. To be sure, I had taken the precaution to get out of his reach. We talked with a large table between us. While wondering what could have enabled him to discover the secret, I defended myself with virtuous indignation. I said, "It cannot be, le Marquis is mistaken. Who would dare touch his papers?" Bast. Instead of listening to me, he flourished an open letter, and said, "This letter has been photographed. Here is proof of it." And he pointed to a little yellow spot on the paper, shrieking out, "Look! Smell! Smell it, you devil!" It is, I forget the name he called it, but some acid used by photographers. I know, said M. Vergeret, go on, what next? Then, patron, we had a scene, what a scene! He ended by seizing me by the throat, and shaking me like a plum tree, saying he would shake me until I told him who I was, what I knew, and where I came from. As if I knew, myself. I was obliged to account for every minute of my time since I had been in his service. The devil was worse than a judge of instruction, in his questions. Then he sent for the hotel porter, who had charge of the front door, and questioned him closely, but in English, so that I could not understand. After a while, he cooled down, and when the boy was gone, presented me with 20 francs, saying, I am sorry I was so sharp with you, you are too stupid to have been guilty of the offense. He said that, did he? He used those very words to my face, patron. And you think he meant what he said? Certainly I do. The fat man smiled, and whistled a little tune expressive of contempt. If you think that, he said, Clameron was right in his estimate of your brilliancy. It was easy to see that Joseph Dubois was anxious to hear his patron's grounds for considering him stupid, but dared not ask. I suppose I am stupid, if you think so, said poor Fanferlot humbly. Well, after he had done blustering about the letters, le Marquis dressed, and went out. He did not want his carriage, but I saw him hire a cab at the hotel door. I thought he had perhaps disappeared forever, but I was mistaken. About 5 o'clock he returned as gay as a bullfinch. During his absence, I had telegraphed to you. What? Did you not follow him? I stayed on the spot in case of his return, but one of our friends kept watch on him, and this friend gave me a report of my dandy's movements. First he went to a broker's, then to the bank and discount office, so he must be collecting his money to take a little trip. Is that all he did? That is all, patron. But I must tell you how the rascals tried to shut up, administratively, you understand, Mlle Paulmeyer. Fortunately you had anticipated something of the kind, and given orders to watch over her safety. But for you, she would now be in prison. Joseph looked up to the ceiling by way of trying to remember something more. Finding nothing there, he said. That is all. I rather think M. Patrigent will rub his hands with delight when I carry him my report. He did not expect to see me any more, and has no idea of the facts I have collected to swell the size of his file 113. There was a long silence. Joseph was right in supposing that the crisis had come. M. Vergeret was arranging his plan of battle while waiting for the report of Nina, now Paulmeyer, upon which depended his point of attack. But Joseph Dubois began to grow restless and uneasy. What must I do now, patron? He asked. Return to the hotel. Probably your master had noticed your absence, but he will say nothing about it, so continue. Here M. Vergeret was interrupted by an exclamation from Prosper, who was standing near a window. What is the matter? He inquired. There is Clameron, cried Prosper, over there. M. Vergeret and Joseph ran to the window. "Where is he?" said Joseph. "I don't see him." "There, at the corner of the bridge, behind that orange woman's stall." Prosper was right. It was the noble Marquis of Clamron, who, hid behind the stall, was watching for his servant to come out of the Archangel. At first the quick-sighted Vergeret had some doubts whether it was the Marquis, who, being skilled in these hazardous expeditions, managed to conceal himself behind a pillar so as to elude detection. But a moment came, when, elbowed by the pressing crowd, he was obliged to come out on the pavement in full view of the window. "Now don't you see I was right?" cried the cashier. "Well," said the amazed Joseph, "I am amazed." Vergeret seemed not in the least surprised, but quietly said, "The game needs hunting." "Well, Joseph, my boy, do you still think that your noble master was duped by your acting injured innocence?" "You assured me to the contrary, patron," said Joseph in an humble tone. "And your opinion is more convincing than all the proofs in the world. This pretended outburst of rage was premeditated on the part of your noble master. Knowing that he is being tracked, he naturally wishes to discover who his adversaries are. You can imagine how uncomfortable he must be at this uncertainty. Perhaps he thinks his pursuers are some of his old accomplices, who, being starved, want a piece of his cake. He will remain there until you come out, then he will come in to find out who you are. But, patron, I can go home without his seeing me." "Yes, I know. You will climb the little wall separating the Archangel from the wine merchant's yard, and keep along the stationer's area, until you reach the Rue de la Huchette." Poor Joseph looked as if he had just received a bucket of ice water upon his head. "Exactly the way I was going, patron," he gasped out. "I heard that you knew every plank and door of all the houses in Paris, and it certainly must be so." The fat man made no reply to Joseph's admiring remarks. He was thinking how he could catch Clamron. As to the cashier, he listened wonderingly, watching these strangers, who seemed determined to reinstate him in public opinion, and punish his enemies, while he himself stood by powerless and bewildered. What their motives for befriending him could be, he vainly tried to discover. "I will tell you what I can do," said Joseph after deep thought. "What is it?" "I can innocently walk out of the front door, and loaf along the street until I reach the Hôtel du Louvre. And then? Dame Clamron will come in and question Madame Alexander, whom you can instruct beforehand, and she is smart enough to put any sharper off the track." "Bad plan," pronounced Vergeret decidedly. "A scamp so compromised as Clamron is not easily put off the track. Now his eyes are opened, he will be pretty hard to catch." Suddenly, in a brief tone of authority which admitted of no contradiction, the fat man said, "I have a way." "Has Clamron, since he found that his papers had been searched, seen Legers?" "No, patron." "Perhaps he has written to him?" "I'll bet you my head he has not. Having your orders to watch his correspondence, I invented a little system which informs me every time he touches a pen. During the last 24 hours the pens have not been touched. Clamron went out yesterday. But the man who followed him says he wrote nothing on the way." "Then we have time yet," cried Vergeret. "Hurry! Hurry! I give you 15 minutes to make yourself ahead, you know the sort. I will watch the rascal until you come up." The delighted Joseph disappeared in a twinkling, while Prosper and Vergeret remained at the window observing Clamron, who, according to the movements of the crowd, was sometimes lost to sight, and sometimes just in front of the window, but was evidently determined not to quit his post until he had obtained the information he sought. "Why do you devote yourself exclusively to the Marquis?" asked Prosper. "Because, my friend," replied Vergeret, "because that is my business, and not yours." Joseph Dubois had been granted a quarter of an hour in which to metamorphose himself. Before 10 minutes had elapsed he reappeared. The dandified coachman with Bergami whiskers, red vest, and foppish manners, was replaced by a sinister-looking individual, whose very appearance was enough to scare any rogue. His black cravat twisted around a paper collar, and ornamented by an imitation diamond pin. His long-tailed black boots and heavy cane revealed the employee of the Rue de Jerusalem, as plainly as the shoulder straps mark a soldier. Joseph Dubois had vanished forever. And from his livery, phoenix-like and triumphant, arose the radiant Fanferlot, surnamed the Squirrel. When Fanferlot entered the room, Prosper uttered a cry of surprise and almost fright. He recognized the man who had assisted the commissary of police to examine the bank on the day of the robbery. M. Vergeret examined his aide with a satisfied look, and said, "Not bad. There is enough of the police court air about you to alarm even an honest man. You understood me perfectly this time." Fanferlot was transported with delight at this compliment. "What must I do now, patron?" he inquired. "Nothing difficult for an adroit man, but remember, upon the precision of our movements depends the success of my plan. Before arresting Lagers, I wish to dispose of Clamaran. Now that the rascals are separated, the first thing to do is to prevent their coming together." "I understand," said Fanferlot, snapping his little rat-like eyes. "I am to create a diversion." "Exactly. Go out by the Rue de la Huchette, and hasten to Saint Michel's bridge. Loaf along the bank, and finally sit on the steps of the quay, so that Clamaran may know he is being watched. If he doesn't see you, do something to attract his attention." "Parbleu! I will throw a stone into the water," said Fanferlot, rubbing his hands with delight at his own brilliant idea. "As soon as Clamaran has seen you," continued M. Vergeret, "he will be alarmed, and instantly decamp. Knowing there are reasons why the police should be after him, he will hasten to escape you. Then comes the time for you to keep wide awake. He is a slippery eel, and cunning as a rat. I know all that. I was not born yesterday. So much the better. You can convince him of that. Well, knowing you are at his heels, he will not dare to return to the Hôtel du Louvre, for fear of being called on by troublesome visitors. Now, it is very important that he should not return to the hotel." "But suppose he does," said Fanferlot. M. Vergeret thought for a minute, and then said, "It is not probable that he will do so. But if he should, you must wait until he comes out again, and continue to follow him. But he won't enter the hotel. Very likely he will take the cars, but in that event don't lose sight of him, no matter if you have to follow him to Siberia. Have you money with you?" "I will get some from Madame Alexander." "Very good. Ah! One more word. If the rascal takes the cars, send me word. If he beats about the bush until night, be on your guard, especially in lonely places. The desperado is capable of any enormity. If necessary, must I fire? Don't be rash, but, if he attacks you, of course defend yourself. Come, 'tis time you were gone." Dubois Fanferlot went out. Vergeret and Prosper resumed their post of observation. "Why all this secrecy?" inquired Prosper. "Clamaran is charged with 10 times worse crimes than I was ever accused of, and yet my disgrace was made as public as possible. Don't you understand," replied the fat man, "that I wish to separate the cause of Raoul from that of the Marquis? But, sh. Look!" Clamaran had left his place near the Orange Woman's stand, and approached the bridge, where he seemed to be trying to make out some unexpected object. "Ah," said M. Vergeret. "He has just discovered our man." Clamaran's uneasiness was quite apparent. He walked forward a few steps, as if intending to cross the bridge. Then, suddenly turning around, rapidly walked in the direction of the Rue Saint-Jacques. "He is caught," cried M. Vergeret with delight. At that moment the door opened, and Madame Nina Gypsy, alias Palmyre Chocorile, entered. Poor Nina! Each day spent in the service of Madeline seemed to have aged her a year. Tears had dimmed the brilliancy of her beautiful black eyes. Her rosy cheeks were pale and hollow, and her merry smile was quite gone. Poor Gypsy, once so gay and spirited, now crushed beneath the burden of her sorrows, was the picture of misery. Prosper thought that, wild with joy at seeing him, and proud of having so nobly devoted herself to his interest, Nina would throw her arms around his neck, and say how much she loved him. To his surprise, Nina scarcely spoke to him. Although his every thought had been devoted to Madeline since he discovered the reasons for her cruelty, he was hurt by Nina's cold manner. The girl stood looking at M. Vergeret with a mixture of fear and devotion, like a poor dog that has been cruelly treated by its master. He, however, was kind and gentle in his manner toward her. "Well, my dear," he said encouragingly, "what news do you bring me?" "Something is going on at the house, monsieur, and I have been trying to get here to tell you, at last, Mli. Madeline made an excuse for sending me out. You must thank Mlle Madeline for her confidence in me. I suppose she carried out the plan we decided upon?" "Yes, monsieur." "She receives the Marquis of Clamerin's visits?" "Since the marriage has been decided upon, he comes every day, and Mademoiselle receives him with kindness. He seems to be delighted." These answers filled Prosper with anger and alarm. The poor young man, not comprehending the intricate moves of M. Vergeret, felt as if he were being tossed about from pillar to post, and made the tool and laughingstock of everybody. "What?" he cried. "This worthless Marquis of Clamerin, an assassin and a thief, allowed to visit at M. Fauvel's, and pay his addresses to Madeline? Where are the promises, monsieur, which you have made? Have you merely been amusing yourself by raising my hopes, to dash them?" "Enough," interrupted M. Vergeret harshly, "you are too green to understand anything, my friend. If you are incapable of helping yourself, at least have sense enough to refrain from importuning those who are working for you. Do you not think you have already done sufficient mischief?" Having administered this rebuke, he turned to Gypsy, and said in softer tones, "Go on, my child, what have you discovered?" "Nothing positive, monsieur. But enough to make me nervous, and fearful of impending danger. I am not certain, but suspect from appearances, that some dreadful catastrophe is about to happen. It may only be a presentiment. I cannot get any information from Madame Fauvel, she refuses to answer any hints, and moves about like a ghost, never opening her lips. She seems to be afraid of her niece, and to be trying to conceal something from her." "What about M. Fauvel?" "I was just about to tell you, monsieur. Some fearful misfortune has happened to him, you may depend upon it. He wanders about as if he had lost his mind. Something certainly occurred yesterday, his voice even is changed. He is so harsh and irritable that Mademoiselle and M. Lucien were wondering what could be the matter with him. He seems to be on the eve of giving way to a burst of anger. And there is a wild, strange look about his eyes, especially when he looks at Madame. Yesterday evening, when M. de Clamerin was announced, he jumped up, and hurried out of the room, saying that he had some work to do in his study." A triumphant exclamation from M. Vergeret interrupted Madame Gypsy. He was radiant. "Hein," he said to Prosper, forgetting his bad humor of a few minutes before, "Hein. What did I tell you? He has evidently been afraid to give way to his first impulse. Of course he has. He is now seeking for proofs of your assertions. He must have them by this time. Did the ladies go out yesterday?" "Yes, a part of the day." "What became of M. Fauvel?" "The ladies took me with them, we left M. Fauvel at home." "Not a doubt of it," cried the fat man, "he looked for proofs, and found them, too. Your letter told him exactly where to go." "Ah, Prosper, that unfortunate letter gives more trouble than everything else together." These words seemed to throw a sudden light on Madame Gypsy's mind. "I understand it now," she exclaimed. "M. Fauvel knows everything. That is, he thinks he knows everything, and what he has been led to fear, and thinks he has discovered, is worse than the true state of affairs. That accounts for the order which M. Cavallon overheard him give to his servant man, Évariste." "What order?" He told Évariste to bring every letter that came to the house, no matter to whom addressed, into his study, and hand them to him. Saying that, if this order was disobeyed, he should be instantly discharged. At what time was this order given? Asked M. Vergeret. Yesterday afternoon. That is what I was afraid of, cried M. Vergeret. He has clearly made up his mind what course to pursue, and is keeping quiet so as to make his vengeance more sure. The question is, have we still time to counteract his projects? Have we time to convince him that the anonymous letter was incorrect in some of its assertions? He tried to hit upon some plan for repairing the damage done by Prosper's foolish letter. Thank you for your information, my dear child, he said after a long silence. I will decide at once what steps to take, for it will never do to sit quietly and let things go on in this way. Return home without delay, and be careful of everything you say and do, for M. Fauvel suspects you of being in the plot. Send me word of anything that happens, no matter how insignificant it may be. Nina, thus dismissed, did not move, but said timidly. What about Caldas, monsieur? This was the third time during the last fortnight that Prosper had heard this name, Caldas. The first time it had been whispered in his ear by a respectable-looking, middle-aged man, who offered his protection one day, when passing through the police office passage. The second time, the judge of instruction had mentioned it in connection with Gypsy's history. Prosper thought over all the men he had ever been connected with, but could recall none named Caldas. The impassible M. Vergeret started and trembled at the mention of this name, but, quickly recovering himself, said, I promise to find him for you, and I will keep my promise. Now you must go. Good morning. It was 12 o'clock, and M. Vergeret suddenly remembered that he was hungry. He called Madame Alexander, and the beaming hostess of the Archangel soon placed a tempting breakfast before Prosper and his friend. But the savory broiled oysters and flaky biscuit failed to smooth the perplexed brow of M. Vergeret. To the eager questions and complimentary remarks of Madame Alexander, he answered, Chut, chut. Let me alone, keep quiet. For the first time since he had known the fat man, Prosper saw him betray anxiety and hesitation. He remained silent as long as he could, and then uneasily said, I am afraid I have embarrassed you very much, monsieur. Yes, you have dreadfully embarrassed me, replied M. Vergeret. What on earth to do now, I don't know. Shall I hasten matters, or keep quiet and wait for the next move? And I am bound by a sacred promise. Come, we had better go and advise with the judge of instruction. He can assist me. Come with me, let us hurry. Chapter 23. As M. Vergeret had anticipated, Prosper's letter had a terrible effect upon M. Fauvel. It was toward 9 o'clock in the morning, and M. Fauvel had just entered his study when his mail was brought in. After opening a dozen business letters, his eyes fell on the fatal missive sent by Prosper. Something about the writing struck him as peculiar. It was evidently a disguised hand, and although, owing to the fact of his being a millionaire, he was in the habit of receiving anonymous communications, sometimes abusive, but generally begging him for money, this particular letter filled him with an indefinite presentiment of evil. A cold chill ran through his heart, and he dreaded to open it. With absolute certainty that he was about to learn of a new calamity, he broke the seal, and opening the coarse café paper, was shocked by the following words. Dear sir, you have handed your cashier over to the law, and you acted properly, convinced as you were of his dishonesty. But if it was he who took 350,000 francs from your safe, was it he also who took Madame Fauvel's diamonds? This was a terrible blow to a man whose life hitherto had been an unbroken chain of prosperity, who could recall the past without one bitter regret, without remembering any sorrow deep enough to bring forth a tear. What? His wife deceive him? And among all men, to choose one vile enough to rob her of her jewels, and force her to be his accomplice in the ruin of an innocent young man. For did not the letter before him assert this to be a fact, and tell him how to convince himself of its truth? M. Fauvel was as bewildered as if he had been knocked on the head with a club. It was impossible for his scattered ideas to take in the enormity of what these dreadful words intimated. He seemed to be mentally and physically paralyzed, as he sat there staring blankly at the letter. But this stupefaction suddenly changed to indignant rage. "What a fool I am!" he cried, "to listen to such base lies, such malicious charges against the purest woman whom God ever sent to bless a man." And he angrily crumpled up the letter, and threw it into the empty fireplace, saying, "I will forget having read it. I will not soil my mind by letting it dwell upon such turpitude." He said this, and he thought it, but, for all that, he could not open the rest of his letters. The anonymous missive stood before his eyes in letters of fire, and drove every other thought from his mind. That penetrating, clinging, all-corroding worm, suspicion, had taken possession of his soul. And as he leaned over his desk, with his face buried in his hands, thinking over many things which had lately occurred, insignificant at the time, but fearfully ominous now, this unwillingly admitted germ of suspicion grew and expanded until it became certainty. But, resolved that he would not think of his wife in connection with so vile a deed, he imagined 1,000 wild excuses for the mischief-maker who took this mode of annoying him. Of course there was no truth in his assertions, but from curiosity he would like to know who had written it. And yet suppose. Merciful God! Can it be true? He wildly cried, as the idea of his wife's guilt would obstinately return to his troubled mind. Thinking that the writing might throw some light on the mystery, he started up and tremblingly picked the fatal letter out of the ashes. Carefully smoothing it out, he laid it on his desk, and studied the heavy strokes, light strokes, and capitals of every word. "It must be from some of my clerks," he finally said, "someone who is angry with me for refusing to raise his salary, or perhaps it is the one that I dismissed the other day." Clinging to this idea, he thought over all the young men in his bank, but not one could he believe capable of resorting to so base a vengeance. Then he wondered where the letter had been posted, thinking this might throw some light upon the mystery. He looked at the envelope, and read the postmark. Rue du Cardinal Lemoyne. This fact told him nothing. Once more he read the letter, spelling over each word, and trying to put a different construction on the horrible phrases that stared him in the face. It is generally agreed that an anonymous letter should be treated with silent contempt, and cast aside as the malicious lies of a coward who dares not say to a man's face what he secretly commits to paper, and forces upon him. This is all very well in theory, but is difficult to practice when the anonymous letter comes. You throw it in the fire, it burns, but, although the paper is destroyed by the flames, doubt remains. Suspicion arises from its ashes, like a subtle poison penetrates the inmost recesses of the mind, weakens its holiest beliefs, and destroys its faith. The trail of the serpent is left. The wife suspected, no matter how unjustly, is no longer the wife in whom her husband trusted as he would trust himself. The pure being who was above suspicion no longer exists. Suspicion, no matter whence the source, has irrevocably tarnished the brightness of his idol. Unable to struggle any longer against these conflicting doubts, M. Fauvel determined to resolve them by showing the letter to his wife, but a torturing thought, more terrible than any he had yet suffered, made him sink back in his chair in despair. "Suppose it be true," he muttered to himself, "suppose I have been miserably duped. By confiding in my wife, I shall put her on her guard, and lose all chance of discovering the truth." Thus were realized all Vergeret's presumptions. He had said, if M. Fauvel does not yield to his first impulse, if he stops to reflect, we have time to repair the harm done. After long and painful meditation, the banker finally decided to wait, and watch his wife. It was a hard struggle for a man of his frank, upright nature, to play the part of a domestic spy, and jealous husband. Accustomed to give way to sudden bursts of anger, but quickly mastering them, he would find it difficult to be compelled to preserve his self-restraint, no matter how dreadful the discoveries might be. When he collected the proofs of guilt one by one, he must impose silence upon his resentment, until fully assured of possessing certain evidence. There was one simple means of ascertaining whether the diamonds had been pawned. If the letter lied in this instance, he would treat it with the scorn it deserved. If, on the other hand, it should prove to be true. At this moment, the servant announced breakfast, and M. Fauvel looked in the glass before leaving his study, to see if his face betrayed the emotion he felt. He was shocked at the haggard features which it reflected. "Have I no nerve?" he said to himself. "Oh, I must and shall control my feelings until I find out the truth." At table he talked incessantly, so as to escape any questions from his wife, who, he saw, was uneasy at the sight of his pale face. But, all the time he was talking, he was casting over in his mind expedients of getting his wife out of the house long enough for him to search her bureau. At last he asked Madame Fauvel if she were going out before dinner. "Yes," said she, "the weather is dreadful, but Madeleine and I must do some shopping." "At what time shall you go?" "Immediately after breakfast." He drew a long breath as if relieved of a great weight. In a short time he would know the truth. His uncertainty was so torturing to the unhappy man that he preferred the most dreadful reality to his present agony. Breakfast over, he lighted a cigar, but did not remain in the dining room to smoke it, as was his habit. He went into his study to try and compose his nerves. He took the precaution to send Lucien on a message so as to be alone in the house. After the lapse of half an hour, he heard the carriage roll away with his wife and niece. Hurrying into Madame Fauvel's room, he opened the drawer of the chiffonier, where she kept her jewels. The last dozen or more leather and velvet boxes, containing superb sets of jewelry which he had presented to her, were gone. 12 boxes remained. He nervously opened them. They were all empty. The anonymous letter had told the truth. "Oh, it cannot be," he gasped in broken tones. "Oh, no, no." He wildly pulled open every drawer in the vain hope of finding them packed away. Perhaps she kept them elsewhere. He tried to hope that she had sent them to be reset, but no, they were all superbly set in the latest fashion. And, moreover, she never would have sent them all at once. He looked again. Nothing. Not one jewel could he find. He remembered that he had asked his wife at the Jean Didier ball why she did not wear her diamonds, and she had replied with a smile. "Oh, what is the use? Everybody knows them so well. And, besides, they don't suit my costume." Yes, she had made the answer without blushing, without showing the slightest sign of agitation or shame. What hardened impudence! What base hypocrisy concealed beneath an innocent, confiding manner! And she had been thus deceiving him for 20 years. But suddenly a gleam of hope penetrated his confused mind, slight, barely possible, still a straw to cling to. Perhaps Valentine has put her diamonds in Madeleine's room. Without stopping to consider the indelicacy of what he was about to do, he hurried into the young girl's room, and pulled open one drawer after another. What did he find? Not Madame Fauvel's diamonds, but Madeleine's 7 or 8 boxes also empty. Great heavens! Was this gentle girl, whom he had treated as a daughter, an accomplice in this deed of shame? Had she contributed her jewelry to add to the disgrace of the roof that sheltered her? This last blow was almost too much for the miserable man. He sank almost lifeless into a chair, and wringing his hands, groaned over the wreck of his happiness. Was this the happy future to which he had looked forward? Was the fabric of his honor, well-being, and domestic bliss, to be dashed to the earth and forever lost in a day? Were his 20 years' labor and high standing to end thus in shame and sorrow? Apparently nothing was changed in his existence, he was not materially injured, he could not reach forth his hand, and heal or revenge the smarting wound, the objects around him were unchanged. Everything went on in the outside world just as it had gone on during the last 20 years, and yet what a horrible change had taken place in his own heart. While the world envied his prosperity and happiness, here he sat, more heartsore and wearied of life than the worst criminal that ever stood before the Inquisition. What? Valentine, the pure young girl whom he had loved and married in spite of her poverty, in spite of her cold offering of calm affection in return for his passionate devotion. Valentine, the tender, loving wife, who, before a year of married life had rolled by, so often assured him that her affection had grown into a deep, confiding love. That her devotion had grown stronger every day, and that her only prayer was that God would take them both together. Since life would be a burden without her noble husband to shield and cherish her, could she have been acting a lie for 20 years? She, the darling wife, the mother of his sons. His sons? Good God! Were they his sons? If she could deceive him now when she was silver-haired, had she not deceived him when she was young? Not only did he suffer in the present, but the uncertainty of the past tortured his soul. He was like a man who is told that the exquisite wine he has drank contains poison. Confidence is never halfway, it is, or it is not. His confidence was gone. His faith was dead. The wretched banker had rested his every hope and happiness on the love of his wife. Believing that she had proved faithless, that she had played him false, and was unworthy of trust, he admitted no possibility of peaceful joy. And felt tempted to seek consolation from self-destruction. What had he to live for now, save to mourn over the ashes of the past? But this dejection did not last long. Indignant anger, and thirst for vengeance, made him start up and swear that he would lose no time in vain regrets. Fauvel well knew that the fact of the diamonds being stolen was not sufficient ground upon which to bring an accusation against any of the accomplices. He must possess overwhelming proofs before taking any active steps. Success depended upon present secrecy. He began by calling his valet, and ordering him to bring to him every letter that should come to the house. He then wrote to a notary at St. Remy for minute and authentic information about the Legers family, and especially about Raoul. Finally, following the advice of the anonymous letter, he went to the prefecture of police, hoping to obtain a biography of Clamaran. But the police, fortunately for many people, are as discreetly silent as the grave. They guard their secrets as a miser his treasure. Nothing but an order from the chief judge could open those formidable green boxes, and reveal their secrets. Fauvel was politely asked what motives urged him to inquire into the past life of a French citizen. And, as he declined to state his reasons, the chief of police told him he had better apply to the procureur for the desired information. This advice he could not follow. He had sworn that the secret of his wrongs should be confined to the 3 persons interested. He chose to avenge his own injuries, to be alone the judge and executioner. He returned home more angry than ever. There he found the dispatch answering the one which he had sent to St. Remy. It was as follows. The Legers are very poor, and there has never been any member of the family named Raoul. Madame Legers had no son, only 2 daughters. This information dashed his last hope. The banker thought, when he discovered his wife's infamy, that she had sinned as deeply as a woman could sin, but he now saw that she had practiced a system more shocking than the crime itself. Wretched creature, he cried with anguish, in order to see her lover constantly, she dared introduce him to me under the name of a nephew who never existed. She had the shameless courage to bring him beneath her husband's roof, and seat him at my fireside, between my sons, and I, confiding fool that I was, welcomed the villain, and lent him money. Nothing could equal the pain of wounded pride and mortification which he suffered at the thought that Raoul and Madame Fauvel had amused themselves with his good-natured credulity and obtuseness. Nothing but death could wipe out an injury of this nature. But the very bitterness of his resentment enabled him to restrain himself until the time for punishment came. With grim satisfaction he promised himself that his acting would be as successful as theirs. That day he succeeded in concealing his agitation, and kept up a flow of talk at dinner. But at about 9 o'clock, when Clamaran called on the ladies, he rushed from the house, for fear that he would be unable to control his indignation at the sight of this destroyer of his happiness. And did not return home until late in the night. The next day he reaped the fruit of his prudence. Among the letters which his valet brought him at noon, was one bearing the postmark of Vézenet. He carefully opened the envelope, and read. Dear Aunt, it is imperatively necessary for me to see you today, so do not fail to come to Vézenet. I will explain why I give you this trouble, instead of calling at your house. Raoul. I have them now, cried M. Fauvel, trembling with satisfaction at the near prospect of vengeance. Eager to lose no time, he opened a drawer, took out a revolver, and examined the hammer to see if it worked easily. He imagined himself alone, but a vigilant eye was watching his movements. Gypsy, immediately upon her return from the Archangel, stationed herself at the keyhole of the study door, and saw all that occurred. M. Fauvel laid the pistol on the mantelpiece, and nervously resealed the letter, which he then took to the box where the letters were usually left. Not wishing anyone to know that Raoul's letter had passed through his hands. He was only absent 2 minutes, but, inspired by the imminence of the danger, Gypsy darted into the study, and rapidly extracted the balls from the revolver. Thank heaven! She murmured, this peril is averted, and M. Vergeret will now perhaps have time to prevent a murder. I must send Cavallon to tell him. She hurried into the bank, and sent the clerk with a message, telling him to leave it with Madame Alexander, if M. Vergeret had left the hotel. An hour later, Madame Fauvel ordered her carriage, and went out. M. Fauvel jumped into a hackney coach, and followed her. God grant that M. Vergeret may reach there in time, cried Nina to herself, otherwise Madame Fauvel and Raoul are lost. Chapter 24. The moment that the Marquis of Clamron perceived that Raoul de Lagers was the only obstacle between him and Madeleine, he swore that the obstacle should soon be removed. That very day he took steps for the accomplishment of his purpose. As Raoul was walking out to Vézenet about midnight, he was stopped at a lonely spot, by 3 men, who asked him what o'clock it was. While looking at his watch, the ruffians fell upon him suddenly, and but for Raoul's wonderful strength and agility, would have left him dead on the spot. As it was, he soon, by his skillfully plied blows, for he had become a proficient in fencing and boxing in England, made his enemies take to their heels. He quietly continued his walk home, fully determined to be hereafter well armed when he went out at night. He never for an instant suspected his accomplice of having instigated the assault. But 2 days afterward, while sitting in a café, a burly, vulgar-looking man, a stranger to him, interrupted him several times while talking, and, after making several rough speeches as if trying to provoke a quarrel, finally threw a card in his face, saying its owner was ready to grant him satisfaction when and where he pleased. Raoul rushed toward the man to chastise him on the spot. But his friends held him back, telling him that it would be much more gentlemanly to run a sword through his vulgar hide, than have a scuffle in a public place. Very well, then, you will hear from me tomorrow, he said scornfully to his assailant. Wait at your hotel until I send 2 friends to arrange the matter with you. As soon as the stranger had left, Raoul recovered from his excitement, and began to wonder what could have been the motive for this evidently premeditated insult. Picking up the card of the bully, he read. W. H. B. Jacobson. Formerly Garibaldian volunteer. Ex-officer of the Army of the South. Italy, America. 30, Rue Leone. Raoul had seen enough of the world to know that these heroes who cover their visiting cards with titles have very little glory elsewhere than in their own conceit. Still the insult had been offered in the presence of others, and, no matter who the offender was, it must be noticed. Early the next morning Raoul sent 2 of his friends to make arrangements for a duel. He gave them M. Jacobson's address, and told them to report at the Hôtel du Louvre, where he would wait for them. Having dismissed his friends, Raoul went to find out something about M. Jacobson. And, being an expert at the business of unraveling plots and snares, he determined to discover who was at the bottom of this duel into which he had been decoyed. The information obtained was not very promising. M. Jacobson, who lived in a very suspicious-looking little hotel whose inmates were chiefly women of light character, was described to him as an eccentric gentleman, whose mode of life was a problem difficult to solve. No one knew his means of support. He reigned despotically in the hotel, went out a great deal, never came in until midnight, and seemed to have no capital to live upon, save his military titles, and a talent for carrying out whatever was undertaken for his own benefit. That being his character, thought Raoul, I cannot see what object he can have in picking a quarrel with me. What good will it do him to run a sword through my body? Not the slightest. And, moreover, his pugnacious conduct is apt to draw the attention of the police, who, from what I hear, are the last people this warrior would like to have after him. Therefore he must have some reason for pursuing me, and I must find out what it is. The result of his meditations was, that Raoul, upon his return to the Hôtel du Louvre, did not mention a word of his adventure to Clameron, whom he found already up. At 8:30 his seconds arrived. M. Jacobson had selected the sword, and would fight that very hour, in the woods of Vincennes. Well, come along, cried Raoul gaily. I accept the gentleman's conditions. They found the Garibaldian waiting, and after an interchange of a few thrusts Raoul was slightly wounded in the right shoulder. The ex-superior officer of the South wished to continue the combat. But Raoul's seconds, brave young men, declared that honor was satisfied, and that they had no intention of subjecting their friend's life to unnecessary hazards. The ex-officer was forced to admit that this was but fair, and unwillingly retired from the field. Raoul went home delighted at having escaped with nothing more serious than a little loss of blood, and resolved to keep clear of all so-called Garibaldians in the future. In fact, a night's reflection had convinced him that Clameron was the instigator of the two attempts to kill him. Madame Fauvel having told him what conditions Madeleine placed on her consent to marriage, Raoul instantly saw how necessary his removal would be, now that he was an impediment in the way of Clameron's success. He recalled 1,000 little remarks and events of the last few days, and, on skillfully questioning the Marquis, had his suspicions changed into certainty. This conviction that the man whom he had so materially assisted in his criminal plans was so basely ungrateful as to turn against him, and hire assassins to murder him in cold blood, inspired in Raoul a resolution to take speedy vengeance upon his treacherous accomplice, and at the same time ensure his own safety. This treason seemed monstrous to Raoul. He was as yet not sufficiently experienced in ruffianism to know that one villain always sacrifices another to advance his own projects. He was credulous enough to believe in the adage, "There's honor among thieves." His rage was naturally mingled with fright, well knowing that his life hung by a thread, when it was threatened by a daring scoundrel like Clameron. He had twice miraculously escaped. A third attempt would more than likely prove fatal. Knowing his accomplice's nature, Raoul saw himself surrounded by snares, he saw death before him in every form. He was equally afraid of going out, and of remaining at home. He only ventured with the most suspicious caution into the most public places. He feared poison more than the assassin's knife, and imagined that every dish placed before him tasted of strychnine. As this life of torture was intolerable, he determined to anticipate a struggle which he felt must terminate in the death of either Clameron or himself. And, if he were doomed to die, to be first revenged. If he went down, Clameron should go too, better kill the devil than be killed by him. In his days of poverty, Raoul had often risked his life to obtain a few guineas, and would not have hesitated to make short work of a person like Clameron. But with money prudence had come. He wished to enjoy his 400,000 francs without being compromised by committing a murder which might be discovered. He therefore began to devise some other means of getting rid of his dreaded accomplice. Meanwhile, he devoted his thoughts to some discreet way of thwarting Clameron's marriage with Madeleine. He was sure that he would thus strike him to the heart, and this was at least a satisfaction. Raoul was persuaded that, by openly siding with Madeleine and her aims, he could save them from Clameron's clutches. Having fully resolved upon this course, he wrote a note to Madame Fauvel asking for an interview. The poor woman hastened to Vézinhet convinced that some new misfortune was in store for her. Her alarm was groundless. She found Raoul more tender and affectionate than he had ever been. He saw the necessity of reassuring her, and winning his old place in her forgiving heart, before making his disclosures. He succeeded. The poor lady had a smiling and happy air as she sat in an armchair, with Raoul kneeling beside her. "I have distressed you too long, my dear mother," he said in his softest tones, "but I repent sincerely. Now listen to my—" He had not time to say more. The door was violently thrown open, and Raoul, springing to his feet, was confronted by M. Fauvel. The banker had a revolver in his hand, and was deadly pale. It was evident that he was making superhuman efforts to remain calm, like a judge whose duty it is to justly punish crime. "Ah," he said with a horrible laugh, "you look surprised. You did not expect me? You thought that my imbecile credulity ensured your safety." Raoul had the courage to place himself before Madame Fauvel, and to stand prepared to receive the expected bullet. "I assure you, uncle," he began. "Enough," interrupted the banker with an angry gesture, "let me hear no more infamous falsehoods. End this acting, of which I am no longer the dupe. I swear to you. Spare yourself the trouble of denying anything. I know all. I know who pawned my wife's diamonds. I know who committed the robbery for which an innocent man was arrested and imprisoned." Madame Fauvel, white with terror, fell upon her knees. At last it had come, the dreadful day had come. Vainly had she added falsehood to falsehood, vainly had she sacrificed herself and others, all was discovered. She saw that all was lost, and wringing her hands she tearfully moaned. "Pardon, André. I beg you, forgive me." At these heartbroken tones, the banker shook like a leaf. This voice brought before him the 20 years of happiness which he had owed to this woman, who had always been the mistress of his heart, whose slightest wish had been his law, and who, by a smile or a frown, could make him the happiest or the most miserable of men. Alas! Those days were over now. Could this wretched woman crouching at his feet be his beloved Valentine, the pure, innocent girl whom he had found secluded in the château of La Verberie? Who had never loved any other than himself? Could this be the cherished wife whom he had worshipped for so many years? The memory of his lost happiness was too much for the stricken man. He forgot the present in the past, and was almost melted to forgiveness. "Unhappy woman," he murmured, "unhappy woman. What have I done that you should thus betray me? Ah, my only fault was loving you too deeply, and letting you see it. One wearies of everything in this world, even happiness. Did pure domestic joys pall upon you, and weary you, driving you to seek the excitement of a sinful passion? Were you so tired of the atmosphere of respect and affection which surrounded you, that you must needs risk your honor and mine by braving public opinion? Oh, into what an abyss you have fallen, Valentine! And, oh, my God! If you were wearied by my constant devotion, had the thought of your children no power to restrain your evil passions? Could you not remain untarnished for their sake?" M. Fauvel spoke slowly, with painful effort, as if each word choked him. Raoul, who listened with attention, saw that if the banker knew some things, he certainly did not know all. He saw that erroneous information had misled the unhappy man, and that he was still a victim of false appearances. He determined to convince him of the mistake under which he was laboring, and said, "Monsieur, I hope you will listen." But the sound of Raoul's voice was sufficient to break the charm. "Silence!" cried the banker with an angry oath, "silence!" For some moments nothing was heard but the sobs of Madame Fauvel. "I came here," continued the banker, "with the intention of killing you both. But I cannot kill a woman, and I will not kill an unarmed man." Raoul once more tried to speak. "Let me finish," interrupted M. Fauvel. "Your life is in my hands. The law excuses the vengeance of an injured husband, but I refuse to take advantage of it. I see on your mantel a revolver similar to mine. Take it, and defend yourself. Never. Defend yourself, cried the banker raising his arm, if you do not. Feeling the barrel of M. Fauvel's revolver touch his breast, Raoul in self-defense seized his own pistol, and prepared to fire. Stand in that corner of the room, and I will stand in this, continued the banker. And when the clock strikes, which will be in a few seconds, we will both fire. They took the places designated, and stood perfectly still. But the horror of the scene was too much for Madame Fauvel to witness any longer without interposing. She understood but one thing: her son and her husband were about to kill each other before her very eyes. Fright and horror gave her strength to start up and rush between the two men. For God's sake, have mercy, André, she cried, wringing her hands with anguish, let me tell you everything. Don't kill. This burst of maternal love, M. Fauvel thought the pleadings of a criminal woman defending her lover. He roughly seized his wife by the arm, and thrust her aside, saying with indignant scorn, "Get out of the way." But she would not be repulsed. Rushing up to Raoul, she threw her arms around him, and said to her husband, "Kill me, and me alone, for I am the guilty one." At these words M. Fauvel glared at the guilty pair, and, deliberately taking aim, fired. Neither Raoul nor Madame Fauvel moved. The banker fired a second time, then a third. He cocked the pistol for a fourth shot, when a man rushed into the room, snatched the pistol from the banker's hand, and, throwing him on the sofa, ran toward Madame Fauvel. This man was M. Vergeret, who had been warned by Cavallon, but did not know that Madame Gypsy had extracted the balls from M. Fauvel's revolver. "Thank heaven," he cried, "she is unhurt." "How dare you interfere?" cried the banker, who by this time had joined the group. "I have the right to avenge my honor when it has been degraded. The villain shall die." M. Vergeret seized the banker's wrists in a vice-like grasp, and whispered in his ear, "Thank God you are saved from committing a terrible crime. The anonymous letter deceived you." In violent situations like this, all the untoward, strange attending circumstances appear perfectly natural to the participators, whose passions have already carried them beyond the limits of social propriety. Thus M. Fauvel never once thought of asking this stranger who he was and where he came from. He heard and understood but one fact: the anonymous letter had lied. "But my wife confesses she is guilty," he stammered. "So she is," replied M. Vergeret, "but not of the crime you imagine. Do you know who that man is, that you attempted to kill? Her lover. No, her son." The words of this stranger, showing his intimate knowledge of the private affairs of all present, seemed to confound and frighten Raoul more than M. Fauvel's threats had done. Yet he had sufficient presence of mind to say, "It is the truth." The banker looked wildly from Raoul to M. Vergeret, then, fastening his haggard eyes on his wife, exclaimed, "It is false. You are all conspiring to deceive me. Proofs." "You shall have proofs," replied M. Vergeret, "but first listen." And rapidly, with his wonderful talent for exposition, he related the principal points of the plot he had discovered. The true state of the case was terribly distressing to M. Fauvel, but nothing compared with what he had suspected. His throbbing, yearning heart told him that he still loved his wife. Why should he punish a fault committed so many years ago, and atoned for by 20 years of devotion and suffering? For some moments after M. Vergeret had finished his explanation, M. Fauvel remained silent. So many strange events had happened, rapidly following each other in succession, and culminating in the shocking scene which had just taken place, that M. Fauvel seemed to be too bewildered to think clearly. If his heart counseled pardon and forgetfulness, wounded pride and self-respect demanded vengeance. If Raoul, the baleful witness, the living proof of a far-off sin, were not in existence, M. Fauvel would not have hesitated. Gaston de Clameren was dead. He would have held out his arms to his wife, and said, "Come to my heart. Your sacrifices for my honor shall be your absolution, let the sad past be forgotten." But the sight of Raoul froze the words upon his lips. "So this is your son," he said to his wife, "this man, who has plundered you and robbed me." "Madame." Fauvel was unable to utter a word in reply to these reproachful words. "Oh," said M. Vergeret, "Madame will tell you that this young man is the son of Gaston de Clamart, she has never doubted it. But the truth is—" "What?" "That, in order to swindle her, he has perpetrated a gross imposture." During the last few minutes Raoul had been quietly creeping toward the door, hoping to escape while no one was thinking of him. But M. Vergeret, who anticipated his intentions, was watching him out of the corner of one eye, and stopped him just as he was about leaving the room. "Not so fast, my pretty youth," he said, dragging him into the middle of the room, "it is not polite to leave us so unceremoniously. Let us have a little conversation before parting. A little explanation will be edifying." The jeering words and mocking manner of M. Vergeret made Raoul turn deadly pale, and start back as if confronted by a phantom. "The clown," he gasped. "The same, friend," said the fat man. "Ah, now that you recognize me, I confess that the clown and myself are one and the same. Yes, I am the mountebank of the Jan Didier ball, here is proof of it." And turning up his sleeve he showed a deep cut on his arm. "I think that this recent wound will convince you of my identity," he continued. "I imagine you know the villain that gave me this little decoration, that night I was walking along the Rue Bourdelot. That being the case, you know, I have a slight claim upon you, and shall expect you to relate to us your little story." But Raoul was so terrified that he could not utter a word. "Your modesty keeps you silent," said M. Vergeret. "Bravo! Modesty becomes talent, and for one of your age you certainly have displayed a talent for knavery." M. Fauvel listened without understanding a word of what was said. "Into what dark depths of shame have we fallen," he groaned. "Reassure yourself, monsieur," replied M. Vergeret with great respect. "After what I have been constrained to tell you, what remains to be said is a mere trifle. I will finish the story. On leaving Mihan, who had given him a full account of the misfortunes of Mli, Valentine de la Verberie, Clamart hastened to London. He had no difficulty in finding the farmer's wife to whom the old countess had entrusted Gaston's son. But here an unexpected disappointment greeted him. He learned that the child, whose name was registered on the parish books as Raoul Valentine Wilson, had died of the croup when 18 months old. "Did anyone state such a fact as that?" interrupted Raoul. "It is false." "It was not only stated, but proved, my pretty youth," replied M. Vergeret. "You don't suppose I am a man to trust to verbal testimony, do you?" He drew from his pocket several officially stamped documents, with red seals attached, and laid them on the table. "These are declarations of the nurse, her husband, and 4 witnesses. Here is an extract from the Register of Births, this is a certificate of registry of his death, and all these are authenticated at the French embassy. Now are you satisfied, young man?" "What next?" inquired M. Fauvel. "The next step was this," replied M. Vergeret. "Clamart, finding that the child was dead, supposed that he could, in spite of this disappointment, obtain money from Madame Fauvel. He was mistaken. His first attempt failed. Having an inventive turn of mind, he determined that the child should come to life. Among his large circle of rascally acquaintances, he selected a young fellow to impersonate Raoul Valentine Wilson, and the chosen one stands before you." Madame Fauvel was in a pitiable state. And yet she began to feel a ray of hope. Her acute anxiety had so long tortured her, that the truth was a relief. She would thank heaven if this wicked man was proved to be no son of hers. "Can this be possible?" she murmured. "Can it be?" "Impossible," cried the banker, "an infamous plot like this could not be executed in our midst." "All this is false," said Raoul boldly. "It is a lie. M. Vergeret turned to Raoul, and, bowing with ironical respect, said, "Monsieur desires proofs, does he? Monsieur shall certainly have convincing ones. I have just left a friend of mine, M. Pallet, who brought me valuable information from London. Now, my young gentleman, I will tell you the little story he told me, and then you can give your opinion of it. In 1847 Lord Murray, a wealthy and generous nobleman, had a jockey named Spencer, of whom he was very fond. At the Epsom races, this jockey was thrown from his horse, and killed. Lord Murray grieved over the loss of his favourite, and, having no children of his own, declared his intention of adopting Spencer's son, who was then but 4 years old. Thus James Spencer was brought up in affluence, as heir to the immense wealth of the noble lord. He was a handsome, intelligent boy, and gave satisfaction to his protector until he was 16 years of age, when he became intimate with a worthless set of people, and turned out badly. Lord Murray, who was very indulgent, pardoned many grave faults, but one fine morning he discovered that his adopted son had been imitating his signature upon some checks. He indignantly dismissed him from the house, and told him never to show his face again. James Spencer had been living in London about 4 years, managing to support himself by gambling and swindling, when he met Clameron, who offered him 25,000 francs to play a part in a little comedy which he had arranged to suit the actors. "You are a detective," interrupted Raoul. The fat man smiled grimly. "At present," he replied, "I am merely a friend of Prosper Bertomy. It depends entirely upon your behavior which character I appear in while settling up this little affair. What do you expect me to do? Restore the 350,000 francs which you have stolen." The young rascal hesitated a moment, and then said, "The money is in this room." "Very good. This frankness is creditable, and will benefit you. I know that the money is in this room, and also exactly where it is to be found. Be kind enough to look behind that cupboard, and you will find the 350,000 francs. Raoul saw that his game was lost. He tremblingly went to the cupboard, and pulled out several bundles of banknotes, and an enormous package of pawnbrokers' tickets. "Very well done," said M. Vergeret, as he carefully examined the money and papers, "this is the most sensible step you ever took." Raoul relied on this moment, when everybody's attention would be absorbed by the money, to make his escape. He slid toward the door, gently opened it, slipped out, and locked it on the outside, the key being still in the lock. "He has escaped," cried M. Fauvel. "Naturally," replied M. Vergeret, without even looking up, "I thought he would have sense enough to do that. But is he to go unpunished? My dear sir, would you have this affair become a public scandal? Do you wish your wife's name to be brought into a case of this nature before the police court? Oh, monsieur. Then the best thing you can do, is to let the rascal go scot-free. Here are receipts for all the articles which he has pawned, so that we should consider ourselves fortunate. He has kept 50,000 francs, but that is all the better for you. This sum will enable him to leave France, and we shall never see him again." Like everyone else, M. Fauvel yielded to the ascendancy of M. Vergeret. Gradually he had awakened to the true state of affairs. Prospective happiness no longer seemed impossible, and he felt that he was indebted to the man before him for more than life. But for M. Vergeret, where would have been his honor and domestic peace? With earnest gratitude he seized M. Vergeret's hand as if to carry it to his lips, and said, in broken tones, "Oh, monsieur! How can I ever find words to express how deeply I appreciate your kindness? How can I ever repay the great service you have rendered me?" M. Vergeret reflected a moment, and then said, "If you feel under any significant obligations to me, monsieur, you have it in your power to return them. I have a favor to ask of you." "A favor? You ask of me? Speak, monsieur, you have but to name it. My fortune and life are at your disposal. I will not hesitate, then, to explain myself. I am Prosper's friend, and deeply interested in his future. You can exonerate him from this infamous charge of robbery, you can restore him to his honorable position. You can do more than this, monsieur. He loves Émile Madeleine. Madeleine shall be his wife, monsieur, interrupted the banker, I give you my word of honor. And I will so publicly exonerate him, that not a shadow of suspicion will rest upon his name. I will place him in a position which will prevent slander from reproaching him with the painful remembrance of my fatal error. The fat man quietly took up his hat and cane, as if he had been paying an ordinary morning call, and turned to leave the room, after saying, "Good morning." But, seeing the weeping woman raise her clasped hands appealingly toward him, he said hesitatingly, "Monsieur, excuse my intruding any advice, but Madame Fauvel." "André," murmured the wretched wife, "André." The banker hesitated a moment. Then, following the impulse of his heart, ran to his wife, and, clasping her in his arms, said tenderly, "No, I will not be foolish enough to struggle against my deep-rooted love. I do not pardon, Valentine, I forget all." M. Vergeret had nothing more to do at Vézenet. Without taking leave of the banker, he quietly left the room, and, jumping into his cab, ordered the driver to return to Paris, and drive to the Hôtel du Louvre as rapidly as possible. His mind was filled with anxiety about Clamaran. He knew that Raoul would give him no more trouble, the young rogue was probably taking his passage for some foreign land at that very moment. But Clamaran should not escape unpunished, and how this punishment could be brought about without compromising Madame Fauvel, was the problem to be solved. M. Vergeret thought over the various cases similar to this, but not one of his former expedients could be applied to the present circumstances. He could not deliver the villain over to justice without involving Madame Fauvel. After long thought, he decided that an accusation of poisoning must come from Oloron. He would go there and work upon public opinion, so that, to satisfy the townspeople, the authorities would order a post-mortem examination of Gaston. But this mode of proceeding required time. And Clamaran would certainly escape before another day passed over his head. He was too experienced a knave to remain on slippery ground, now that his eyes were open to the danger which menaced him. It was almost dark when the carriage stopped in front of the Hôtel du Louvre. M. Vergeret noticed a crowd of people collected together in groups, eagerly discussing some exciting event which seemed to have just taken place. Although the policeman attempted to disperse the crowd by authoritatively ordering them to move on, they would merely separate in one spot to join a more clamorous group a few yards off. "What has happened?" demanded M. Vergeret of a lounger nearby. "The strangest thing you ever heard of," replied the man. "Yes, I saw him with my own eyes. He first appeared at that 7-story window, he was only half-dressed. Some men tried to seize him, but, bast! With the agility of a squirrel, he jumped out upon the roof, shrieking, 'Murder! Murder!' The recklessness of his conduct led me to suppose." The gossip stopped short in his narrative, very much surprised and vexed, his questioner had vanished. If it should be Clamaran, thought M. Vergeret, if terror has deranged that brain, so capable of working out great crimes, fate must have interposed. While thus talking to himself, he elbowed his way through the crowded courtyard of the hotel. At the foot of the staircase he found M. Fanferlot and 3 peculiar-looking individuals standing together, as if waiting for someone. "Well," cried M. Vergeret, "what is the matter?" With laudable emulation, the 4 men rushed forward to report to their superior officer. "Patron," they all began at once. "Silence," said the fat man with an oath, "one at a time. Quick! What is the matter?" "The matter is this, patron," said Fanferlot dejectedly. "I am doomed to ill luck. You see how it is. This is the only chance I ever had of working out a beautiful case, and, paf. My criminal must go and fizzle. A regular case of bankruptcy. Then it is Clamaran who? Of course it is. When the rascal saw me this morning, he scampered off like a hare. You should have seen him run. I thought he would never stop this side of Ivry, but not at all. On reaching the Boulevard des Écoles, a sudden idea seemed to strike him, and he made a beeline for his hotel, I suppose, to get his pile of money. Directly he gets here, what does he see? These three friends of mine. The sight of these gentlemen had the effect of a sunstroke upon him. He went raving mad on the spot. The idea of serving me such a low trick at the very moment I was sure of success. Where is he now? At the prefecture, I suppose. Some policeman handcuffed him, and drove off with him in a cab. Come with me. M. Vergeret and Fanferlot found Clameron in one of the private cells reserved for dangerous prisoners. He had on a straitjacket, and was struggling violently against three men, who were striving to hold him, while a physician tried to force him to swallow a potion. "Help!" he shrieked. "Help, for God's sake! Do you not see my brother coming after me? Look! He wants to poison me." M. Vergeret took the physician aside, and questioned him about the maniac. "The wretched man is in a hopeless state," replied the doctor. "This species of insanity is incurable. He thinks someone is trying to poison him, and nothing will persuade him to eat or drink anything. And, as it is impossible to force anything down his throat, he will die of starvation, after having suffered all the tortures of poison." M. Vergeret, with a shudder, turned to leave the prefecture, saying to Fanferlot, "Madame Fauvel is saved, and by the interposition of God, who has himself punished Clameron." "That don't help me in the least," grumbled Fanferlot. "The idea of all my trouble and labor ending in this flat, quiet way. I seem to be born for ill luck." "Don't take your blighted hopes of glory so much to heart," replied M. Vergeret. "It is a melancholy fact for you that file number 113 will never leave the record office. But you must bear your disappointment gracefully and heroically. I will console you by sending you as bearer of dispatches to a friend of mine, and what you have lost in fame will be gained in gold." Chapter 25. For days had passed since the events just narrated, when one morning M. Lecoq, the official Lecoq, who resembled the dignified head of a bureau, was walking up and down his private office, at each turn nervously looking at the clock, which slowly ticked on the mantel. As if it had no intention of striking any sooner than usual, to gratify the man so anxiously watching its placid face. At last, however, the clock did strike, and just then the faithful Janouille opened the door, and ushered in Madame Nina and Prosper Bertomy. "Ah," said M. Lecoq, "you are punctual. Lovers are generally so." "We are not lovers, monsieur," replied Madame Gypsy. "M. Vergeret gave us express orders to meet here in your office this morning, and we have obeyed." "Very good," said the celebrated detective, "then be kind enough to wait a few minutes, I will tell him you are here." During the quarter of an hour that Nina and Prosper remained alone together, they did not exchange a word. Finally a door opened, and M. Vergeret appeared. Nina and Prosper eagerly started toward him, but he checked them by one of those peculiar looks which no one ever dared resist. "You have come," he said severely, "to hear the secret of my conduct. I have promised, and will keep my word, however painful it may be to my feelings. Listen, then. My best friend is a loyal, honest man, named Caldas. 18 months ago this friend was the happiest of men. Infatuated by a woman, he lived for her alone, and, fool that he was, imagined that she felt the same love for him." "She did," cried Gypsy. "Yes, she always loved him. She showed her love in a peculiar way. She loved him so much, that one fine day she left him, and ran off with another man. In his first moments of despair, Caldas wished to kill himself. Then he reflected that it would be wiser to live, and avenge himself. And then, faltered Prosper. Then Caldas avenged himself in his own way. He made the woman who deserted him recognize his immense superiority over his rival. Weak, timid, and helpless, the rival was disgraced, and falling over the verge of a precipice, when the powerful hand of Caldus reached forth and saved him. You understand all now, do you not? The woman is Nina, the rival is yourself, and Caldus is. With a quick, dexterous movement, he threw off his wig and whiskers, and stood before them the real, intelligent, proud Lecoq. Caldus! Cried Nina. No, not Caldus, not Vergeret any longer, but Lecoq, the detective. Lecoq broke the stupefied silence of his listeners by saying to Prosper. It is not to me alone that you owe your salvation. A noble girl confided to me the difficult task of clearing your reputation. I promised her that Fauvel should never know the shameful secrets concerning his domestic happiness. Your letter thwarted all my plans, and made it impossible for me to keep my promise. I have nothing more to say. He turned to leave the room, but Nina barred his exit. Caldus, she murmured, I implore you to have pity on me. I am so miserable. Ah, if you only knew. Be forgiving to one who has always loved you, Caldus. Listen. Prosper departed from Lecoq's office alone. On the 15th of last month, was celebrated, at the church of Notre Dame de Lorette, the marriage of Prosper Bertomy and Mlle Madeleine Fauvel. The banking house is still on the Rue de Provence, but as Fauvel has decided to retire from business, and live in the country, the name of the firm has been changed, and is now Prosper Bertomy and Company.